The wind came down off the fields, still raw from turning, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Two horses approached the yard at a walk. The woman kept her eyes down, not shy, holding something very still inside her chest, the way a person carries a full bucket across uneven ground. The old man dismounted first, didn't offer his hand. "You understand what you're taking on?" "Not a question," the farmer answered carefully. "I understand what I'm agreeing to. I don't pretend to understand the rest of it yet." She remained beside the horse, one hand flat against its shoulder. A name was spoken correctly, for the first time. Something passed over her face that wasn't fear and wasn't grief. Something closer to surprise. They walked toward the house, not touching. Two people entering the same door at the same pace. The door closed behind them. Behind the house, the fields stayed dark and waiting. New Mexico territory, April 1880. The wind came down off the fields, still raw from turning, carrying the smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Elias Merrick stood in his own yard with his hat in his hand, waiting on a woman he had spoken to exactly once in his life. 11 words. He'd counted them, lying awake the night before, because counting felt like something to do with his hands when his hands had nothing else. He'd been up since before the birds, walked the fence line twice, though nothing about the fence needed walking, and stood a long while at the edge of the north field, looking at the dark, turned earth without really seeing it. Somewhere behind him, in the house, he could hear Agnes moving through the kitchen earlier than usual, the particular quiet clatter of a woman keeping her hands busy so her mind wouldn't have room to worry out loud. Obie had already gone out to the barn twice, for no reason either of them named, and come back both times without having done anything in it. Elias had put on his good shirt, the one he wore to town and to church suppers and to nothing else, and had stood a long moment in front of the small shard of mirror hanging by the washstand, studying a face that looked, to his own eye, exactly like it had looked every other morning of his life, which struck him, standing there, as strange. A man's whole life could turn a corner this sharp, and his own reflection wouldn't so much as blink about it. He'd thought, more than once in the small hours, about walking out to the little plot behind the north fence where Sarah was buried, and decided against it twice, and gone anyway the third time, standing there in the gray pre-dawn with his hat in his hands, saying nothing out loud, because there was nothing he knew how to say that wouldn't have sounded like an apology, or an explanation, or both. He wasn't sure which one he owed her. Maybe neither. Maybe a man was allowed to build a second kind of life without it costing the first one anything. He hoped that was true. He wasn't entirely certain of it, standing now in the yard with the wind picking up and his good shirt already sticking faintly to his back in the morning heat. But he'd decided, somewhere between the fence line and the graveside and this yard, that hoping it was true would have to be enough to carry him through the morning. Two horses came up the wagon road at a walk. Clesta rode in front, straight-backed, a blanket folded over the saddle in front of him, though the morning wasn't cold enough to need it. Behind him, a half-length back, the girl, Taji. Elias had said the name to himself maybe 40 times since the barn conversation 3 days ago. Said it until it stopped sounding strange in his mouth. It still sounded strange in his mouth. She kept her eyes down as the horses came into the yard. Not shy, exactly. Elias had seen shy before, on other women, at other times, and this wasn't that. This was a woman holding something very still inside her chest, the way you'd carry a full bucket across uneven ground. Spill nothing. Look at nothing. Just get across. Clesta dismounted first. Didn't offer his hand to his daughter. She didn't need it, and both of them seemed to know that offering it would have been its own kind of insult, as if this morning hadn't already taken enough from her, without taking her balance, too. Elias Merrick. Clesta said the name like he was setting it down on a table between them, weighing it. Clesta. Elias nodded. Didn't reach to shake hands. He'd learned that much, at least, in 3 days of thinking about nothing else. Some things you don't rush. The old man's eyes moved past him to the porch, to the barn, to the fields, turned dark, and waiting behind the house, and then back to Elias's face, looking for the storm behind the calm. You understand what you're taking on. Not a question. Elias answered it anyway. I understand what I'm agreeing to. A pause. I don't pretend to understand the rest of it yet. Something moved behind Clesta's eyes. Not quite approval. Closer to relief that the man hadn't lied to him. Taji hadn't moved from where she stood beside the horse, one hand resting flat against its shoulder, Like the animal was the only steady thing left in the world, and she meant to keep a piece of that steadiness for herself. Her hair was braided the way Elias imagined it always was, dark against a blue trade-cloth dress, and there was nothing about her that looked like a woman coming to her own wedding. She looked like a woman standing at the edge of a river she hadn't chosen to cross, waiting to see if the current would be as bad as she feared. Elias walked toward her, slow, the way a man walks toward a horse that doesn't know him yet. Taji, he said it careful, wanting to get it right the first time because he understood without anyone telling him that getting it wrong would cost something he couldn't afford to spend on the first morning. She looked up, and for one moment just when something passed over her face that wasn't fear and wasn't grief, something closer to surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to say her name at all, as if she'd braced herself for squaw or girl, or nothing, just a hand reaching for her arm, the way you'd reach for property already paid for. You said it right, she said, quiet, barely more than breath. I practiced. He hadn't meant it as anything. But something in it, the plainness of it maybe, the way he admitted to practicing a stranger's name like it mattered, cracked something loose in her face, not a smile. Not yet. But the edge of one, waiting somewhere behind her eyes for permission to exist. Clesta watched all of it, watched his daughter's face, watched the farmer's face. And though he said nothing, his shoulders eased, just slightly, the way a man's shoulders ease when a bet he wasn't fully sure of starts to look like it might pay out after all. The night before, Taji's mother had come to sit beside her at the edge of the sleeping mats, long after the fire had burned down to coals, and had said almost nothing for a long while. Then she'd taken Taji's hand and turned it over, palm up the way she used to when Taji was a girl, and had scraped it on the rocks along the creek. You are not being sent away, her mother said finally. You are being sent towards something. There's a difference even when it doesn't feel like one tonight. It feels like being sent away. I know. Her mother's thumb traced a slow line across her palm. It felt that way to me too. The year I married your father, different reasons. Same feeling. She was quiet a moment. He is not choosing you, this Merrick, the way your father chose me. But your father chose him. And your father does not choose carelessly. Whatever else you carry into that house tomorrow, carry that much with you too. Taji hadn't answered. Hadn't needed to. Her mother had stayed until she finally slept, and was gone by the time the sky started to gray, already at the fire, already working, as if the ache of sending her only daughter into a stranger's house could be folded down, small enough to fit inside an ordinary morning's chores. 3 weeks before the wedding, Taji had come back to her father's camp on foot at dusk alone. Nobody had asked her yet, not out loud. But her mother had looked at her the way mothers look one long pass, head to middle to face again, and something in that look had already known before Taji said a single word. She had gone that spring to trade with a rancher 2 days east, a man named Weston Marsh, who bought hides and sold rifles, and had a way of talking that made a girl forget, for whole afternoons at a time, that she was supposed to be careful. He'd told her things, that he'd take her east once the trading season ended, that his family would come around, given time, that none of it mattered the difference between them, the way people in town would look at her because he'd already decided, and once Weston Marsh decided a thing, it was as good as done. She'd believed him. That was the part she couldn't forgive herself for. Later, lying awake in her father's lodge with her hand pressed flat against a belly that hadn't even begun to show yet, still flat, still secret, still hers alone to carry. Not that she'd loved him, that she'd believed him. The last time she saw him, he didn't even get down from the wagon. It's not. He'd stopped, started again. It's not something I can bring home, Taji. You understand that. A man's got a name to think of. And I don't. He hadn't answered that. Just flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled. And that was the whole of it, no shouting, no cruelty even. Just a man deciding a thing wasn't his problem, and driving away from it at a walking pace. Like there was nothing left in the conversation worth hurrying for. She'd stood in the road a long time after the wagon was gone, long enough that the light changed. Long enough that she had to walk the last mile home in the dark, which she'd never once been afraid to do before, and was that night, for reasons that had nothing to do with the dark itself. By the time she reached her father's fire, she'd already decided not to cry in front of him. She managed that much. What she hadn't decided, what she still hadn't decided, 3 weeks later, riding into a stranger's yard on a borrowed calm, was what came after the not crying. A body doesn't stop needing an after, just because the plan that was supposed to carry her through it drove off in a wagon, without looking back. Word moved through the camp the way it always did. Never loud. Just a pause before her name, where there hadn't used to be one. A look held half a second, too long. Her mother's sister, who used to laugh easy around her, finding reasons to be somewhere else when Taji came near the cookie fires. Clesta said nothing about any of it for 11 days. He rode alone to think, most mornings that spring, not far. Just far enough that the camp couldn't watch a headman's face. While he decided things, a headman wasn't supposed to need help deciding. There was more sitting on this than his daughter's shame, though he let himself believe, on the better days, that shame was the whole of it. Garrett Pruitt had been out twice that winter. The federal agent came with papers and a soft voice and a smile that never once reached far enough up his face to touch his eyes, and both times he'd said the same thing in different words, that the agency was watching how things stood out here, that a band without order, without a headman who could show the territory a settled, respectable people, might find itself moved, consolidated. Words Pruitt used like they cost him nothing, though Clesta understood exactly what they'd cost his people if they ever came due. A scandal now, an unmarried girl carrying a white rancher's child. The whole territory talking would hand Pruitt exactly the kind of disorder he'd been looking for an excuse to name. Clesta told himself riding out that first time to find Elias Merrick, that he was doing this for Taji, a husband, a name for the child that would close a door before the territory finished deciding what to say through it. All of that was true. It was also true, though he had not said this part aloud to anyone, not even to his wife, that he had watched Elias for Merrick 2 years before this spring ever asked anything of the man. Watched him from a distance. Elias never once knew he was being watched across. He had seen it happen with his own eyes, 18 months back, standing near the back of the trading post, where a man could watch without being watched in return. An old Apache man named Two Elk had brought in a season's worth of hides, good ones, carefully worked, and a rancher named Purdy had run them across his scale with the particular carelessness of a man who didn't expect to be questioned. The needle had settled at a number that made Two Elk's jaw tighten, though he'd said nothing a man learns after enough seasons of trading in a territory that doesn't much care to hear his complaints when speaking up costs more than it's worth. Clesta had watched from across the room, his own business half finished, weighing whether to say something himself, and already half certain of how it would land if he did. A headman's word carried weight with his own people. It carried considerably less with a rancher scale. It was Elias who moved first. He'd been standing near the counter buying nails, of all the ordinary things, and had glanced over at the scale the way anyone glances at anything, and something in the reading had snagged his attention enough to make him look twice. He walked over without any particular hurry to it, studied the scale a moment, then reached out and tapped the needle gently with one finger, watching it settle a second time, lower than where Purdy had read it the first. "Runs light," Elias said. Not loud, not a question. "Read it again." Purdy's face had gone tight. "Scale's fine. Merrick, mind your own business." "It is my business, long as I'm standing here watching a man get cheated in front of me." Elias hadn't raised his voice at all, which had somehow made the words land harder than shouting would have. "Read it again, out loud, so the room hears the same number I do." A few other men in the store had gone quiet, watching now, the way a room goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen that it doesn't want to have missed. Purdy had looked around at all of them, every face he might have expected to back him. Every face that had, up to that point, found something more interesting to study on the far wall, and found, to his evident surprise, no support waiting anywhere in the room. He'd read the scale again, out loud. The correct number, lower than his first claim, but higher than what he'd tried to pay. "Pay the man the difference," Elias said. "Full weight. That's all I'm asking." Purdy had paid it, muttering the whole time about being told his business by a man who ought to mind his own affairs, and Elias had said nothing further, simply nodded once to Two Elk, the old man's face carefully unreadable, though something had moved behind his eyes and gone back to his nails, as if nothing worth remarking on had happened at all. He hadn't known Clesta was there, hadn't known anyone was watching who'd remember it. Clesta remembered it. Remembered it the way a man remembers the handful of moments in his life that quietly rearrange what he believes is possible from other people. He'd gone home that evening and said nothing to anyone about what he'd seen, but he'd carried it with him after, filed away in the part of a headman's mind that keeps track, without meaning to, of which men in the territory could be trusted and which could not. So when the trouble came, when there was nowhere left to send his daughter that wouldn't cost her everything, there was only one name that came to him without a second thought behind it. Not because Elias Merrick was known to be a good man, though he was that too, in the way the whole territory understood the word, but because Clesta had seen, once, with his own eyes, that the goodness didn't stop at the edge of who was watching. He did not know, riding home that first day with the saddle beside him empty, which reason weighed heavier in the end. The shame or the 6 words in the trading post, or the fear of Pruitt's soft voice and softer smile. He suspected he never would know. Some decisions don't come apart clean enough to be sorted once they're made. They just sit there, whole, and you carry them. 3 days before the wedding, Clesta rode alone to the Merrick place and found Elias at the barn, working a length of harness leather that didn't especially need working. A man's hands need something to do when his mind's got nowhere good to go. They talked first about small things. The price grain was fetching this season, which was to say the poor price it was fetching. A fence line Elias meant to move before summer, if the bank gave him room enough to think past next month at all. Clesta let the small talk run its course and die on its own. Then he turned his hat once in his hands, the only sign, in a face otherwise still, that this cost him something to say. I need something from you, Elias. Bank trouble? Elias set the leather down. I could speak to Halloran, might be I could. No. Clesta looked at him straight on. I need you to marry my daughter. Elias went still. The particular kind of still a man goes when he's nearly sure that he must have misheard. Clesta didn't make him ask twice. He laid it out plain, no dressing on it, no softening the shape of what he was asking. Taji was carrying a child. The father was gone, and wasn't coming back to claim any part of it. And there was no road forward for her in this territory, not one that didn't end in the kind of talk that follows a woman the rest of her life, unless a husband's name stood beside her own before the child came. I thought of no one else, Clesta said. I want you to understand that. Not as a compliment. As a fact you should know before you answer. He told him why. Told him about the trading post, the scale, the 6 words, the room full of men who'd looked away, and the one man who hadn't. Told him he'd watched him since. Watched him keep Obi and Agnes on through a season lean enough that a harder man would have let them go and called it business sense. Watched him settle every account at the mercantile before it came due, even when it cost him sleep to manage it. A man could put on 2 days of decent behavior for an audience, Clesta said. He didn't believe 2 years of it was a performance. If I have to hand my daughter's name to a man, he said, I could think of no one I'd trust with it more than you. He laid out what he could offer in return. Enough, if Elias judged it wisely, to see the farm through the season and past it, and beyond that without being asked, because he understood a man needed to hear the shape of the thing before he'd agree to stand inside it. He laid out an understanding that would sit alongside the marriage, unspoken to the territory but spoken plainly here, in this barn, between 2 men. Elias would not be made to love a wife he hadn't chosen for himself. Taji would not be made to answer to a husband who held her circumstance over her. Not in word, not in the quiet ways that hurt worse than words. Separate rooms until and unless she said otherwise. No hand laid on her without her word going first. And in 3 years' time, if she wished to leave for her own people, for a life she'd have chosen without any of this standing behind her, Elias would not stand in her way. Elias was quiet a long moment, turning the shape of it over. Why me? Plain, not the trading post story. The real reason. A man in your position could find a dozen farmers in this territory who'd take the offer you're making, glad for the money alone. A dozen who'd take the money. Clesta didn't blink. Not a dozen I'd trust my daughter's name once the money ran out and the marriage still had years left in it. Money buys a wedding, Elias. It doesn't buy what happens after, on the nights nobody else is watching. And you think you know what happens after. From one afternoon in a trading post. I think I know what a man does when he believes nobody's keeping score. That tells me more than 100 afternoons where he knows he's being watched. Clesta held his eyes. I could be wrong about you. I've been wrong about men before. But I'd rather be wrong, having asked the one who might say no for the right reasons, than right having never asked at all. And if I say no, then I ride to the next name on a list a good deal shorter than I'd like it to be, and I hope I judge that man half as well as I hope I'm judging you. Clesta's jaw worked once. But I came to you first, Elias. Not because you were easiest. Because you were the only name I trusted enough to make the ride. Elias looked out toward the fields a long moment, saying nothing, and Clesta let the silence sit between them, unhurried, the way a man lets a horse decide on its own time whether to take a jump. What happens to her? Elias asked finally. If I say no and the next man you ask says no too. Something flickered across Clesta's face, the first crack, however small, in the composure he'd carried through the whole conversation. Then I keep asking. And if the asking runs out before an answer does, we manage. My people have managed harder things than one difficult season, but I won't pretend to you that it costs nothing. It would cost her plenty in this territory to carry a child with no name standing beside her own. None of it went on paper. Clesta didn't offer a contract. Elias didn't ask for one. You have my word, Clesta said, then you have mine. But Elias didn't say yes, not yet. He asked for time to think it through, and Clesta, who hadn't dared hope for an answer that fast gave it to him, and rode home with the saddle beside him, carrying nothing but the weight of what he'd just asked a stranger to become. There was a second reason Elias asked for those 3 days, one he hadn't offered Clesta and wouldn't have known how to put into words if he had. 3 years back he'd buried a wife, Sarah. He didn't say the name out loud much anymore, not because it hurt too much to say it, though it did, some days, in a smaller way than it used to, but because there was no longer anyone left in the house who'd known her well enough to need reminding. A fever had taken her in 9 days flat, the winter before Emmett turned 17, and Elias had spent every one of those 9 days making promises to a woman who couldn't hear half of them by the end, promises about a future that never came due. He'd told himself after that he wouldn't do that again, wouldn't stand over anybody and hand out words bigger than what he could actually deliver. It was part of why the promise he'd eventually make to Taji. I can't promise I'll love it like it's my own, but I can promise I'll treat it well would come out of him sounding so careful, so stripped down to the studs. He'd learned, the hard way, what it cost to promise more than a man could keep. He didn't mean to make that mistake twice. He walked out to the barn that evening, after Clesta rode off, and stood a long while by the old cradle Sarah had never gotten the chance to use, still stored up in the loft under a canvas he hadn't touched in 3 years, and thought about wood, and time, and whether a man got more than one chance at the kind of house that cradle was built for. Elias didn't go back into the house that afternoon. He walked instead to the small room off the kitchen that served as his office, sat down at the desk, and opened the ledger to that morning's figures, like they might have rearranged themselves into something kinder while he wasn't looking. They hadn't. The note at the bank still wanted more than this year's crop was likely to bring, even in a good season, and this hadn't shaped up to be a good season yet. Obi hadn't said a word about it in weeks, which told Elias plenty, coming from a man who'd say anything else that crossed his mind, unasked at any hour of the day. Emmett 19 now, though Elias still sometimes caught himself thinking of him as the 13-year-old he'd taken in, hadn't asked what would happen to him if the place went under. Hadn't asked because some part of him had never once let himself wonder. Elias meant to keep it that way as long as he had any say in it. Agnes probably knew how bad the numbers stood. Agnes generally knew. She'd never once let on that she was worried, which was exactly the kind of thing that told Elias she was. So this wasn't really a question about whether he could love a woman he'd spoken to for exactly 11 words in his life. That question felt too far off to matter yet, almost beside the point, next to the one sitting closer. Because Obi was 61, with nowhere else standing, and no family left living who'd take him in if the bank came calling. Because Agnes had run this kitchen since before Elias was tall enough to reach the table on his own. Because Emmett had never asked, and never would, unless Elias let the ground fall out from under all 3 of them first. He closed the ledger. He didn't need 3 days, in the end, though he let Clesta believe it had taken the whole of them. The thinking had already mostly been done in 100 small reckonings over the past year, each one stacking quiet on top of the last, until they added up to exactly this kind of morning, arriving before he'd quite noticed how close it had gotten. The night before the wedding, he'd called Obi, Agnes, and Emmett into the kitchen after supper, and told them plainly, the same way he told most things, I'm marrying tomorrow. He didn't dress it up. A young woman named Taji, Clesta's daughter. She's carrying a child that isn't mine, and won't be, not by blood, and I mean to raise it anyway, best I know. Nobody spoke for a moment. Emmett's mouth had opened, the way it did before a question he hadn't thought all the way through. and Agnes reached over without looking and set a hand on his arm, which was as good as a word telling him to wait. "Whose is it?" Obi asked finally. Not unkind. Just wanting the shape of the thing before he decided what to make of it. "Not mine to say. Hers when she's ready, if she ever is." Elias looked around the table at the three of them, the only family he had left, in every way that mattered more than blood. "I won't ask any of you to treat her like anything but what she is. My wife. This house's newest member. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd give her the same patience you gave me, back when I didn't know one end of a plow from the other." Agnes was the first to nod. "Well, somebody's got to teach the girl to bake, I expect. Might as well be me." Obi said nothing right away, working something over behind his eyes. Then, "Man doesn't marry to save a farm, Elias. Whatever else is sitting behind this." "No," Elias agreed. "He doesn't." That seemed to satisfy something in the old man, though he didn't say what. Emmett, finally given room to speak, grinned wide enough to split his face. "We're getting a sister, then?" "Something like that." "Well, hell." Emmett caught himself, glanced at Agnes, amended it fast. "Heck, that's fine by me, Elias. More than fine." It wasn't much of a blessing, as blessings went, but it was honest, and given everything else that had happened that spring, honest was worth more than most things Elias could have asked for instead. Emmett had his own reasons for meaning it so plainly, reasons that went back 6 years, to a winter when he'd been 13 and alone in the world, in a way most boys that age never had cause to understand. His own family had come west with a wagon train that broke apart somewhere south of the territory, scattered by fever and bad luck, and a river crossing that had gone wrong in ways nobody afterward wanted to talk about in much detail. Emmett had wandered into town, half-starved, parentless, with nothing to his name but the clothes on his back, and a stubborn refusal to let anyone see him cry about any of it. Elias had found him sleeping in the mercantile storeroom, having broken in not for thieving but simply for shelter, and had done the one thing nobody else in town had thought to do in the 2 weeks the boy had been drifting through it unclaimed. He'd taken him home. Didn't ask him nothing that first night. Obi told Taji once, much later, when the story came up sideways the way most of the household's history tended to. Just fed him, and gave him a bed, and told him in the morning he could stay as long as he was willing to work for his keep, same as anybody else on the place. Boy cried himself to sleep that first week, thinking nobody heard him through the walls. Everybody heard him. Nobody ever once let on that they had. So when Emmett said family's family, don't matter how new the family is, he wasn't speaking in the abstract. He was speaking from the plain, remembered fact of having once been exactly as unmoored as Taji had been, riding into this yard on a borrowed calm, and having found, in this particular stretch of ground, something sturdier than blood to stand on instead, which brought him back to the yard the next morning, hat in hand. A woman standing in front of him who had just told him he'd said her name right, like it was the first kind thing anyone had offered her in 3 weeks, and maybe it was. Clesta performed no ceremony that morning that would come later, brief and legal, inside the house, once he'd said what needed saying out here first. He stepped close enough that his voice didn't need to carry past the 3 of them. "I don't ask you to love her." He looked at Elias steady. "Only that you never treat her poorly." "I won't." Elias didn't look away from him when he said it. Not now. Not later. Nothing more passed between the 2 men. Clesta studied him a moment longer, as if the words alone weren't quite proof enough, as if he needed to watch them settle into the farmer's face before he'd trust they'd take root there. Then he nodded, once, and turned toward the house where a magistrate from town arranged quiet, 3 days back, alongside everything else waited to make the thing legal, in under 10 minutes. He didn't look back at his daughter on the way, though Elias noticed, watching him go, that the old man's shoulders didn't sit quite as straight going in as they had coming up the road. Taji hadn't moved. Elias turned to her. "You don't have to walk in beside me," he said. "Quiet so it wouldn't carry to the house. Not if you'd rather come after. I only mention it because nobody told me what you'd want, and I didn't think it was mine to guess." She looked at him a long moment, something in her face working through a calculation he couldn't see the sum of. "Nobody's asked me what I'd want in 3 weeks," she said. "You're the first. Then what do you want?" A pause. Long enough that he thought she might not answer at all. "I want to walk in on my own feet," she said finally. "Not led. Just walking. Same as you." "All right." They walked in together. Not touching. 2 people entering the same door at the same pace, which was, Elias understood without either of them saying so, exactly as much closeness as either one of them had room for yet. The ceremony took less than 10 minutes. A magistrate's flat voice, a few lines of legal language that meant everything and felt like nothing, Clesta standing witness with his hat in both hands, and no music, no flowers, nothing about it that either of them would ever call a wedding except the paper itself, and the two names written new across the bottom of it once the ink dried. Afterward, Clesta lingered only long enough to press his daughter's hand once, briefly, and to say something to her low enough that Elias didn't catch the words. Whatever it was, Taji's chin lifted a fraction when she heard it, not quite a smile, but the posture of a woman deciding to stand a little straighter than she had all morning. Then the old man rode out, and the yard went quiet in the particular way a place goes quiet after something large has just finished happening in it. Elias led her toward the barn, where Agnes was already wiping her hands on her apron, where Obi stood with his arms folded, where Emmett grinned like a boy who'd been promised a party, and hadn't yet learned to hide how badly he wanted one. "This is Taji," Elias said. Nothing more. No explanation. The three of them would learn what they needed to in time, and he'd told them already the night before plainly, without dressing it up as more than it was. Agnes stepped forward first, taking Taji's hand in both of hers, work ruined and warm. "Well," she said, "come on in out of the sun, girl. Standing in a yard never fed anybody." Obi gave a short nod, said nothing at all. His eyes moved once quick to the loose fold of Taji's dress at the waist, not unkindly, just noting, and then back to his boots. Emmett opened his mouth, shut it again fast, at a look from Agnes. Standing there in the barn doorway, Taji found herself studying the three of them the way she might have studied a new trading party, reading what she could from posture and silence before anyone had said enough to be read from words alone. Agnes moved like a woman who had run this kitchen through droughts and floods, and at least one funeral that had left its mark on the whole household, and had decided, somewhere along the way, that briskness was the only kind of grief that got anything done. Obi carried himself like a man who'd buried more than Agnes had a wife. Taji would learn later, and two children lost young, back in a life before this farm, before Elias, before any of the people standing in this barn had known him and had settled, since into a wariness that took a great deal to crack, and almost nothing at all to shatter if a person wasn't careful with it. And Emmett was simply young, in the particular way of someone who'd been handed enough kindness early enough in his life that he hadn't yet learned the world was capable of taking it back. Taji found herself hoping, watching him grin at nothing in particular, that the world would be slow about teaching him otherwise. "You'll want the room at the end of the hall," Agnes said, already moving toward the house. "Come on, then. Standing in a barn won't get you settled any faster." Later, with the door closed between them and the yard, Elias spoke to her alone for the first time since the barn. "This isn't a real marriage." He said it plain. No cushioning. Not the way people mean the word. But it doesn't have to be an ugly one either. He paused, choosing the next part with more care than he'd chosen anything all day. "In this house, anything that concerns only you, your day, your time, your say in things that's yours to decide. I won't ask you to answer to me for it." She nodded, hadn't found her voice yet. "You didn't have a choice," as he went on. "I did. Wasn't much of one, either way you look at it. But it was mine to make, and yours wasn't. So the least I can give you is that much back." When her voice came, it was barely above the wind still moving outside. "And if you start it again." One hand moved without her seeming to notice, resting flat against her middle. "When it comes. And after. I know it isn't yours." She looked up at him then, and something in her face braced the way a person braces before a blow they already believe is coming. "I only ask that you don't look at it unkindly. Whatever happens between us, whatever I do, whatever I don't please, don't let that fall on it." It didn't ask for any of this either. Elias was quiet long enough that she looked away again, down at her own hands waiting for something she'd already decided she didn't want to hear. "I can't promise I'll love it like it's my own." He said it slow. "Careful. I don't know yet if I will. That'd be a lie, and I won't start this house on one." He waited until she looked up before he finished. "But I can promise I'll treat it well. That much I can give you now. And it won't change later, not if the year goes easy, not if it goes hard. That part's already decided." It wasn't the answer of a man making a vow he hadn't thought through. It was the answer of a man who didn't hand out promises. He wasn't certain he could keep a lesson he'd learned once already. at a cost he never spoke of, and it would turn out to matter more than anything either of them said in that first hour. Before he left her to Agnes and the rest of the afternoon's work, he stopped at the door. "You're carrying. Do only what's light. Agnes will see to the heavier work, and whatever you need, ask her plain. She won't make you ask twice." A pause. Something almost like the start of a smile, though it didn't quite arrive. Obi's a stubborn old man. Plain-spoken past the point most folks find comfortable. But there's no unkindness in him, whatever his face says, while he's deciding what to make of you. Give him time. Then he was gone, out toward fields, still dark from the season's first turning her marriage begun like the wheat going into the ground behind him, on soil neither of them had chosen, with no way yet to know what either one of them would grow into out of it. She stood a long moment after the door closed, alone in a house that smelled of wood smoke and someone else's years, and let herself do the thing she hadn't allowed in front of her father, in front of the magistrate, in front of the 3 strangers watching her arrive. She let 2 tears fall, just 2. Then she wiped them with the flat of her hand, quick, embarrassed at having spent even that much water on a morning that hadn't offered her much reason for softness. There was no going back now. The paper was signed. Her name sat new beside a stranger's at the bottom of it, and whatever came next, however it went, however he turned out to be once the door of politeness wore thin, she'd have to meet it, standing on her own feet, the way she'd asked to walk in. So she squared her shoulders and went to find Agnes, because there was work to be done, and work, she was learning already in the space of one single morning, might turn out to be the only thing steady enough to hold on to in this new unchosen ground. Agnes led her that evening to a room at the far end of the hall, small but clean, with a quilt folded neat at the foot of the bed and a window that faced east, toward morning. "This was my niece's room, once, when she stayed with us a summer." Agnes smoothed the quilt with one hand, unnecessarily, the way people do when their hands need something to do, while their mouth says something else. "It's been empty a long while. Glad to see somebody in it again." Taji looked around the small room, bare walls, a washstand, a chair by the window, and felt, for the first time since the wagon rolled away from her 3 weeks back, something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite fear. Something closer to the beginning of a held breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you," she said, "for today, for all of it." Agnes waved a hand, brisk, embarrassed by gratitude the way some people are embarrassed by too much sugar in their coffee. "Wasn't nothing but common decency, girl. You'll find plenty of that in this house, and precious little else fancy to go with it. Sleep well. Morning comes early around here, married or not." She left the lamp burning low and pulled the door most of the way shut, and Taji sat a long while on the edge of the bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house, settling around her a floorboard somewhere, a door latch, low voices from the kitchen that she couldn't make out the words of until, sometime past midnight, she finally slept. 3 miles east, in a narrow office above the bank on Cedar Street, Cyrus Renner sat with a stack of loan papers spread across his desk and a small, satisfied smile that he kept for moments when no one else was in the room to see it. He'd heard about the wedding that morning, same as everyone in town would hear by supper. A farmer marrying an Apache girl, sudden as weather turning. Most men in town would call it charity, or scandal, or both, depending on which pew they sat in come Sunday. Renner didn't much care what it was called. He cared what it meant for the note sitting in the folder. In front of him, Elias Merrick's note, 4 years old. The water rights on the Merrick land written into the fine print in language most farmers never bothered reading closely enough to understand what they'd signed. He'd bought that note quiet 8 months back from a bank in Santa Fe that didn't much care who held the paper as long as the paper got paid for. Bought it because the Merrick land sat square across the only reliable creek water for 6 miles in any direction, water that belonged, by every practical measure that mattered more to Renner than any treaty line drawn in Washington, to whoever held the deed once the note came due and the farmer couldn't cover it. He'd started small, years back, buying up notes nobody else in the territory wanted, on land nobody else thought worth the trouble. A rancher named Dawes had been the first, though Renner didn't think of him often anymore, and when he did, it wasn't with anything resembling regret. A man who couldn't keep track of his own signature had no business complaining about what happened to the note carrying it. That was simply how the arithmetic of the territory worked. As far as Cyrus Renner was concerned, and he'd never once lost sleep over which side of that arithmetic other men found themselves standing on. He'd come west with nothing but a clerk's education and a talent for numbers that had served him poorly back east, where 100 other men had the same talent and better connections besides. Out here, in a territory still young enough that most of its paperwork got handled by men who'd rather be doing anything else, that same talent had made him something close to indispensable, and Renner had learned early that indispensable men, if they were careful, could bend a great many rules that would have broken lesser men clean in half. He didn't think of himself as dishonest. On the rare occasions he thought of himself in those terms at all. He thought of himself as efficient. The territory was going to end up in fewer, larger hands. Eventually that much seemed obvious to any man who could read a ledger and a map together, and Renner had simply decided, years back, that he intended to be one of the hands it ended up in, rather than one of the many it passed through on its way there. A wedding wouldn't change the note, wouldn't change the numbers. If anything, Renner thought, turning a pen slow between his fingers, another mouth to feed on that land might hurry things along a little faster than they'd have moved on their own. He made a small note in the margin of the loan file. Nothing urgent yet. Just a date circled. 3 weeks out, the day the next payment came due, and the day, Renner suspected, watching the ink dry, that Elias Merrick's new marriage would start earning its keep in ways the farmer hadn't thought to plan for. He closed the folder, went back to his ledgers, and didn't think of the wedding again that day, because to a man like Cyrus Renner, other people's weddings were never anything more than a line item waiting to be entered under the right column. That evening, once the house had gone quiet, Elias sat alone at his desk with the ledger open in front of him and Obi standing in the doorway, arms still crossed, not yet ready to leave the subject alone. "You didn't ask me," Obi said, not accusing.
Just stating a fact he'd been chewing on all day.
No. Elias didn't look up from the figures. Would have told you the same thing either way. Man's got a right to marry who he pleases. Obi shifted his weight. Don't mean I won't say what I think of the banknote while I'm sitting here. Say it then. Renner's been asking around town. Quiet-like. Who holds what paper on whose land? Obi's jaw worked once, side to side. Man like that don't ask questions he don't already know the answer to. He's fishing for something else. Confirming it, more like. Elias set the pen down, looked up at the old man for the first time since he'd started talking. "You think he's after something particular?" "I think," Obi said, slow. "A man don't buy up paper on land he don't want, and don't go asking after other men's debts unless he's got a reason bigger than being neighborly. Renner ain't neighborly. Never has been." Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, the wind that had carried the smell of unfallen rain all morning finally made good on its promise, the first fat drops hitting the porch roof, slow at first, then faster. "Keep an ear out," Elias said finally. "That's all I'll ask of you tonight." Obi nodded, turned to go. Stopped in the doorway, half in shadow. "That girl's carrying more than a child into this house." Elias. "Don't mean any of it's her doing. Just means you'd best keep your eyes open along with the rest of us." Then he was gone, boots heavy on the hall floor, and Elias sat alone with the ledger, the rain picking up outside, and a feeling settling into his chest he couldn't yet put a clean name to. Not quite dread, not quite hope, but something standing close enough to both that he suspected, before the year was out, he'd come to know its face a great deal better than he did tonight. He found Obi again a few minutes later, out at the barn checking the horses one last time before turning in, a chore that didn't strictly need doing but that Obi had never once, in all the years Elias had known him, been willing to skip. "You said something earlier." Elias leaned against the stall door. "About her carrying more than a child into this house." Didn't sound like a passing remark. Obi didn't look up from the bridle he was inspecting, though his hands slowed. "Wasn't one." "Say the rest of it then." The old man was quiet long enough that Elias thought he might not answer at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost its usual flatness, gone instead into something older and more careful. "Had a wife once before this place. Before you were more than a boy trailing after your father in these same fields." Obi set the bridle down slow, deliberate, the way a man handles something he doesn't often take out to look at. 2 children besides. Lost all 3 the same winter, back in Missouri, and the wife nursing him next, and the older boy not long after that. Buried all 3 inside 11 days. Elias said nothing. There wasn't a right thing to say to a fact like that, and he'd learned enough since Sarah, Not to reach for the wrong one, just to fill a silence. Came west after, Obi went on. Wasn't running from grief. Exactly. More like I didn't know how to be a man with a family anymore, and didn't much want to be a man, without the shape of one either. So, I went looking for a version of family that didn't ask me to be quite so much of anything. Your father took me on when I was younger than Emmett is now, and never once asked me to talk about any of it, and that suited me fine for a good many years. And now there's a woman in this house carrying a child same age as the one I buried first. Obi's jaw worked once, the old grief moving visible under the words, even though his face stayed mostly still. I ain't been unkind to her. Don't mistake the quiet for unkindness. But I won't pretend it's been easy, watching her carry that weight around this place, and not feeling something old wake up in me that I'd rather have left sleeping. You didn't have to tell me that. No. Obi picked the bridle back up, resumed his inspection, the conversation closing itself the way Obi closed most conversations, abrupt and without ceremony. But you asked plain, and I figured you'd earned a plain answer. Don't go treating me different, for it come morning. I've managed this long without anybody's pity, and I mean to keep managing without it. Elias nodded, understanding well enough not to offer any of the comfort the old man had just warned him off of, and left him to the horses, carrying the new weight of the story back toward the house with him, filed away alongside everything else he was learning, that spring, about the people whose lives had quietly become bound up with his own. He closed the ledger, blew out the lamp, and sat a while longer in the dark, listening to the rain find the roof, thinking of a woman 2 doors down who'd asked, for the first time in 3 weeks, to walk somewhere on her own 2 feet, and wondering, though he'd never have said it aloud to anyone, what else she might ask for, given time, and whether he'd have it in him to give it to her when she finally did. Outside, the rain kept coming. Steady now, the patient kind, the kind that soaks down into ground already turned and waiting, settling into soil that had that very morning taken on a new shape it hadn't held the day before. Neither of them knew yet what would grow out of it. Neither of them knew yet how many people were already watching to make sure nothing did. The next morning came gray and washed clean by the night's rain, and Taji woke before the rest of the house, lying still a moment in the unfamiliar room, listening for sounds that would tell her whether it was safe yet to get up. She heard Agnes in the kitchen, first, then Obi's boots crossing the yard, and finally, when she judged the hour decent enough, dressed and made her way down the hall toward the smell of coffee. The kitchen went quiet when she stepped into it. Not unkindly, just the particular hush of people who hadn't yet decided what an ordinary morning was supposed to look like with a new person sitting at the table. Sit, Agnes said, recovering first, setting a plate down with more force than the gesture strictly needed. Eggs is eggs whether you're married a day or a decade. No sense standing on ceremony over breakfast. Elias came in from the barn a few minutes later, hat still on, and stopped a half step in the doorway at the sight of her already seated, already fed, already looking less like a stranger in his kitchen than he'd expected to see so soon. Morning, he said. Simple. Testing the word, morning. She said it back the same way, and something about the plainness of the exchange, no more complicated than 2 people who'd known each other for years, greeting each other over breakfast the way they had 100 mornings before, seemed to ease something in the room that neither of them could have named directly. Obi ate in his usual silence. Emmett talked enough for both of them, filling the quiet with an account of a fence post that had come loose in the storm, entirely unbothered by the strangeness of the morning, as if a new sister-in-law appearing at the table were no stranger an occurrence than the weather changing. It wasn't comfortable, not yet. But it wasn't unbearable either, and Taji found, walking out afterward to help Agnes with the wash, that unbearable had been the thing she'd feared most, and its absence felt, that first morning, almost like a kind of gift. Clesta rode home slower than he'd ridden out that morning, letting the horse pick its own pace along the wet road, the empty saddle beside him, a weight he hadn't expected to feel quite this heavy. He thought of his wife, waiting at the fire, who would ask him only one question when he arrived, was it done, and would read the rest of it in his face, the way she always did, without needing the words spelled out for her. She had spent that same morning, in fact, unable to settle to any single task for more than a few minutes at a time, moving between the fire and the door and the fire again, until her sister had finally taken the mending out of her restless hands and told her, not unkindly, to sit down before she wore a path through the packed earth floor. She'll be well, her sister had said. Clesta chose carefully. You said so yourself, a dozen times over these past 3 weeks. I know what I said. Taji's mother had stared at the fire a long while, watching it without really seeing it. Knowing a choice is sound doesn't make the letting go of her any easier. I don't imagine it's supposed to. She'd gone about her morning chores mechanically after that, present in body and absent everywhere else, until she heard the horse on the road, at last one horse, not two, and understood, before Clesta had even dismounted, that whatever had happened in that yard 3 miles distant, her daughter was not riding home beside him. Not today. Perhaps, if all went as it was meant to, not ever again in quite the way she had before. Well? She asked, when he'd come close enough. It's done. Clesta swung down slow, older looking than he had 3 days back, when this whole business had first begun. He said her name right first try. It wasn't much of an answer on its face. But Taji's mother understood, hearing it, exactly the weight her husband meant to hand her with those 5 smugful words, and found, standing there in the yard with the fire crackling behind her, that it was enough to let the worst of the morning's dread finally loosen its grip on her chest. That's something, she said. I think it might be everything, Clesta answered, though I won't know for certain for some months yet. They stood together a while longer in the yard, saying little else. Two people who had raised a daughter through droughts and hard winters, and now had to learn how to keep loving her from a slight distance, the particular ache of parents whose child has crossed over into a life the parents can watch, but no longer fully share. It was, Taji's mother thought, walking back toward the fire once Clesta had seen to the horse, one of the harder lessons a parent had to learn, and one nobody ever seemed to warn a person about in advance, that loving a child well sometimes meant handing her, carefully, deliberately, into ground you yourself had no further say over. He thought of Pruitt, and the soft voice, and the smile that never reached his eyes, and told himself that whatever else came of this spring, he had at least closed one door the agent had been counting on walking through. And he thought, though he tried not to dwell on it too long, of his daughter's face in that yard, the surprise on it, small and startled, when a stranger had said her name right on the first try. It wasn't much. It was, he suspected, riding the last mile home in the fading light, exactly as much as either of them had any right to hope for on a morning like this one, and perhaps, in its own quiet way, a great deal more. June came in hot and stayed that way, and the first loaf Taji pulled from Agnes's oven came out black on the bottom and raw enough in the middle to still be dough. She stood over it a long moment, waiting for Agnes to say something about it, ready to take whatever landed and not let her face show the weight of it. Agnes only took the pan from her hands, scraped the worst of it into the hog bucket without a word wasted on ceremony. Fire runs hotter on the left side of that oven. She said it plain, already reaching for a second bowl of dough. Nobody tells you that till they've burned something first. Welcome to the club, that was all. No lecture. No look that said what kind of woman can't even bake bread. Just a second bowl set down in front of her before the first pan had finished smoking, and Taji understood, standing there with flour still on her hands, that this was as close to kindness as she'd been shown by anyone outside her own family in longer than she wanted to count. The second loaf came out better. Not good. Better. It went that way through most of June, one small failure at a time, Agnes standing close enough to catch her before it turned into real disaster, and far enough back to let every mistake still feel like her own to fix. She scorched a pot of beans past saving. She hung washout in weather that turned to rain within the hour, and had to haul it all back in soaked, cursing herself under her breath in a language Agnes didn't understand a word of, but seemed to follow anyway by the tone alone. She didn't know eggs kept better in the cellar than the pantry, until she'd lost half a dozen to the June heat, and Agnes only sighed, and showed her the cellar steps and said nothing more about it than that. Not once did Agnes make her feel foolish. She corrected her, the way you'd correct a niece plain, no weight behind it, already moving on to the next thing, before the last one had time to sting. There was one afternoon, mid-June, when Taji tried her hand at churning butter for the first time, and got the whole business so thoroughly wrong. Too warm a cream, too slow a rhythm that after nearly an hour of steady work, she had nothing to show for it but an aching arm and a churn full of cream that stubbornly refused to separate into anything resembling butter at all. She sat back on her heels, flushed and frustrated, and found, without entirely meaning to, that her eyes had gone hot and wet in a way that had nothing at all to do with butter. Agnes, passing through with an armful of linens, took one look at her and set the linens down without comment. "It's not the butter," Agnes said. "Not a question." "No." Taji wiped at her eyes, furious at herself for the tears. Furious that something as small as failed butter had cracked open a door she'd been keeping carefully shut all month. "I don't know what it is." "I do." Agnes settled down on the stool across from her, unhurried, as if she had the whole afternoon to spare, which, Taji suspected, she'd simply decided to make true, regardless of what chores were actually waiting. "You've been holding yourself together plenty tight since April, girl. A person can only hold that tight for so long before something's got to give, and it's usually something small and foolish that finally cracks it loose. Butter, in your case, was a broken plate. For me, my first year married. Cried for 20 minutes over a plate that wasn't even a good one." Taji laughed, wet and unexpected, somewhere between the tears. "That's a strange comfort, Agnes. Strange comforts are the only kind worth much, in my experience." Agnes reached over and took the churn herself, resuming the rhythm with an ease born of 40 years' practice. "Go on, and have your cry if it wants having. I'll finish the butter. It'll still be there waiting whenever you're ready to come back to it." Taji didn't cry long. Didn't need to. In the end, the offer alone seemed to loosen most of what had been sitting tight in her chest, and by the time Agnes handed the churn back, still short of finished butter, but considerably closer to it, something in Taji's shoulders had eased that hadn't eased fully since the wagon rolled away from her back in the spring. One afternoon, elbow-deep in wash water, Agnes asked her, offhand, whether she'd ever had a mother teach her these things at all, or whether the trading life had left no room for it. "My mother taught me plenty," Taji said. "Different things. How to tan a hide till it's soft as cloth. How to read weather in a herd of pronghorn before it turns. Nobody ever showed me how a stove burns hotter on one side than the other." Well, Agnes wrung out a shirt with more force than it strictly needed. "Sounds to me like you've got the harder half already learned. This part's just details." She glanced sideways, something gentler working under the brisk tone. "You'll teach me the pronghorn business sometime. Fair trade." It wasn't much, as offers went. But Taji found herself smiling into the wash water, the first real smile she could remember giving anyone since the wagon rolled away from her in the spring. Agnes rarely spoke of her own history, but pieces of it surfaced sideways, over the summer, the way pieces of a person's life tend to surface when the work of a shared kitchen keeps two women standing close together for hours at a stretch. She'd come out to the territory as a young bride herself, Taji learned, married to a man who died of a fall from a half-broke horse before their first anniversary, and had come to work for Elias's father not long after, more out of necessity than any grand design, and had simply never found a reason compelling enough to leave once the necessity eased. "Thought I'd stay a season or two," Agnes said once, kneading bread with more force than the dough strictly required, the way she tended to when a memory had snuck up on her uninvited. That was going on 26 years back now. Funny how a person's plans have a way of rearranging themselves around whatever's actually standing in front of them. "Do you regret it?" "Staying, not for one single day." Agnes said it without hesitation, the kneading easing back to its ordinary rhythm. "Might have had a family of my own, different circumstances. But I got one anyway, just a different shape than I'd have drawn up on paper beforehand. Elias, and now you, and that boy who eats more than his weight in biscuits every week of his life." She glanced over, something unguarded in it. "Turns out the family you build is worth just as much as the one you're handed, girl. Sometimes more, on account of you had to work harder for it." Taji thought about that a long while after, turning it over the way she turned over most things Agnes said in passing that landed heavier than their casual delivery suggested they were meant to. She was coming to understand, simply how the older woman handed out her deepest truths sideways, unannounced, buried in the middle of an ordinary task, so a person could take them or leave them without either choice, costing much in the way of ceremony. She took this one, and kept it, and found herself returning to it more than once in the months that followed, whenever the ache of missing her own mother's fire grew sharp enough to need something steady to set against it. Sundays, the household gathered for a supper a little more deliberate than the rest of the week's meals. Nothing fancy, but a roast instead of beans, and everyone lingering a while afterward instead of scattering straight back to chores. The first Sunday in June, Taji sat through it, mostly quiet, still learning the rhythms of a table where five people talked over each other without meaning any harm by it. But by the second Sunday, she found herself drawn, almost without deciding to be, into the current of it. "Tell them about the buffalo hunt," Emmett said to her, halfway through supper, apropos of nothing. "Agnes was saying you grew up trading. Must have seen things." "Which buffalo hunt?" Taji allowed herself the smallest smile. "There were several, any of them." "All of them." Emmett leaned forward, genuinely curious in the unguarded way of someone who'd never learned to hide interest behind manners. "Obi won't tell stories. Says he's too old for it." "I'm too sensible for it," Obi said, not looking up from his plate. "There's a difference." Taji told them one anyway, a hunt from when she was 12, riding behind her uncle, the ground shaking under a herd wide enough to blot out the horizon, and the particular terror and thrill of a fall she'd taken that year that had left her with a scar along one forearm she still carried. Emmett listened with his fork forgotten halfway to his mouth. Even Obi, pretending not to, had stopped eating by the time she got to the part about the fall. "You're lucky to be sitting here telling it," Elias said, when she finished. "I've been told that about several things this year." She said it lightly, but something under the lightness landed heavier in the room than she'd meant it to, and for a moment nobody quite knew what to say back to that. Agnes broke the quiet, standing to clear plates with more bustle than the task required. "Well, lucky or not, there's pie, if anybody's got room left for it." There was, as it turned out, always room left for Agnes's pie, and the evening rolled on from there into easier things. Emmett's terrible jokes, Obi's grudging half-smiles at them, despite himself, the particular warmth of a table that had, without anyone announcing it, begun to include one more chair than it used to. Obi was a different matter entirely. He said almost nothing to her that first month beyond what the work strictly required, and what little he did say came clipped, flat, without warmth sitting anywhere behind it. Taji understood well enough why, even if understanding it didn't make the silence any easier to stand inside of. Obi was one of 3 people on this farm who knew the whole shape of her circumstance, not the polite version the territory would eventually settle on and repeat at church suppers, but the truth underneath it. And a man who'd spent 30 years on this land, who'd watched it nearly go under this past year for reasons that had nothing whatsoever to do with her, had earned the right to be slow about deciding what to make of the woman who'd walked into the middle of it. So she didn't ask him to be otherwise. She only kept doing her share of the work in front of him, day after day, and let him take his own time deciding. It was the ledger that gave her the first real foothold. She'd gone into the little office off the kitchen looking for nothing more than a pen. Agnes wanted a list written for the mercantile, and once the ledger fell open under her hand, she couldn't quite make herself close it again. The columns were a mess. Figures crossed out and rewritten crooked in the margins. Receipts tucked loose between the pages instead of copied in properly, half of them water-stained past reading. It was the kind of disorder that would have driven her half mad at her father's fires, where every trade got counted twice and argued over until the numbers matched. She sat down, and without asking anyone's leave, began sorting it into something that made sense. Elias found her there 2 evenings later, desk covered edge to edge in reorganized figures, ink still drying on a fresh page. He looked at it a long moment, long enough that she read it herself for whatever was coming. "That's been needing doing for a year," he said finally. "I didn't ask first. I noticed." He almost smiled. "Didn't quite let it land all the way. Keep going." He didn't thank her outright. Not in so many words. But she began noticing small things after that. The way you notice weather changing before you can name exactly what's different about the air. An extra armful of firewood, stacked by her door before she'd thought to ask for it. A loose board in the hallway floor, fixed without a word, the day after she'd mentioned in passing, to no one in particular, that it creaked under her feet at night. Agnes let slip, offhand over the washing, that Elias had told her to keep Taji off the well pump entirely. The bucket ran too heavy for a woman carrying, he'd said. And that was the end of the discussion as far as he was concerned. Nobody had asked Taji's opinion on the matter. She found, standing there listening to Agnes repeat it, that she didn't especially mind. Agnes noticed the noticing. Said nothing outright about that either, but Taji caught her once, setting 2 cups instead of 3 at the kitchen table. On a morning, Emmett had gone into town, leaving her and Elias to share the coffee pot in a silence that wasn't quite as empty as a silence ought to be. between two people who'd exchanged 11 words the day they married and hadn't found many more since. It happened again the following week, this time with the mending. Agnes's hands too full with wash to take up Elias's torn shirt, so it fell. Somehow nobody quite arranged it, or everybody did, which amounted to the same thing in a house this size too. Taji, who sat across the table from him while she worked the needle, and he oiled a bridle, and neither of them talked much. Both of them, if either had thought to notice out loud, entirely comfortable in it. Emmett, for his part, treated her like she'd always been there. Teased Obi without mercy, hit his hat twice in 1 week, whistled old trail songs off-key just to watch the old man's jaw tighten. Once switched the salt and the sugar in the kitchen, and very nearly got his ears boxed for it by Agnes, before Obi even discovered the trick for himself. He folded Taji into the teasing as easy as if she were a cousin who'd simply been away a while and had finally come home. He never once asked her about the child, not out loud, not sideways either, the way some men might have a look, a pause, an unfinished sentence left hanging to see if she'd fill it. It plainly never occurred to Emmett that there was anything worth asking about at all. She was Mrs. Merrick, she was carrying. Those were simply two facts sitting side by side, and he saw no reason either one needed explaining to him. What he did ask about, endlessly, unashamedly, was everything else. He wanted to know how a person tanned a hide soft enough to sleep under. Wanted to know if it was true a body could read a storm a full day off just by watching how the deer moved. Wanted to know, one afternoon mending fence beside her while Elias and Obi worked the far pasture, whether she'd ever killed anything bigger than a rabbit. An elk, she told him. Once. My uncle claimed I only wounded it, and he finished the job, and I've spent 6 years telling anyone who'll listen that he's a liar. Was he lying? Absolutely. She kept her face perfectly straight. But he's older than me, and older men in my family don't take well to being corrected in front of witnesses, so the story stays his version whenever he's present, and mine whenever he isn't. Emmett laughed loud enough that a bird startled out of the nearby brush, and something in the easy, uncomplicated warmth of it settled into Taji's chest in a way she hadn't expected fence-mending to produce. He didn't ask his questions to make a display of himself, the way some people asked things collecting her answers like curiosities to repeat later at the mercantile. He asked because he was young and curious and had decided, somewhere in his own quiet way, that she was worth being curious about. You ever miss it? He asked once. More careful than his usual chatter, living out at your father's camp instead of here? She considered the question honestly before answering it. Some days. Not the way you might think, though. I don't miss it like a person misses something taken from them. More like a person misses a season that's ended. You don't wish it back exactly. You just remember it was good, while it lasted, and let it be good without needing it to still be happening. Emmett turned that over a moment, nodding slow, the way a boy nods at something a little too big to fully hold yet, but worth trying to hold anyway. That's a fine way to think about it, he said finally, and went back to the fence, and neither of them said much else the rest of the afternoon, though the quiet between them by then had long since stopped being the kind that needed filling. Midway through June, Taji rode out one Sunday afternoon with Elias's blessing, and Emmett trailing a respectful distance behind on his own horse, sent along less as an escort than as an excuse for Elias to make sure she had one to see her mother's camp. Her mother cried a little, seeing her, though she tried to hide it in the business of building up the fire higher than it needed to be. Her father was out riding the northern boundary, and didn't come in until near dusk, and when he did, he studied his daughter's face a long moment before he asked anything at all. You're well? I'm well. She hesitated. It's not what I'd have chosen, but it isn't unkind either. He keeps his word. Something eased in Clesta's shoulders, the same way it had in the yard the morning of the wedding. That's more than most arrangements can promise. She stayed only a few hours. Her mother fed her more than she could comfortably eat, the way mothers do when they've spent weeks worrying whether their daughter is eating enough elsewhere, and pressed a small bundle of dried herbs into her hands for the sickness that still came some mornings. Is he good to you? Her mother asked, low, while they worked side by side sorting the last of the spring's dried meat. Not a question meant for anyone else to hear. He is. Taji considered how much more to say, and found there was more than she'd expected. He built a loose board back into the hallway floor, because I mentioned once in passing that it creaked. Didn't ask if I wanted it fixed. Just fixed it. Her mother's hand stilled a moment on the meat. That's not nothing. I know. Taji looked down at her own hands. I don't know what to call what's growing there yet. But it isn't nothing. Her father joined them before the meal, dust still on his boots from the boundary ride, and studied his daughter's face the way he always did before he trusted his ears alone. Whatever he found there seemed to satisfy him, because the questions he might have asked stayed unspoken, replaced instead with an easier kind of conversation: the price of hides that season, a horse he was thinking of trading, small things that asked nothing hard of either of them. She rode back before dark with Emmett humming badly off-key the whole way home, unbothered by her silence, filling it easily enough with his own chatter about nothing in particular: a dog he'd once had, a fish he swore had been the size of his arm, opinions on which of Agnes's pies stood above the rest. She found, riding beside him under a sky gone orange at the edges, that she didn't mind the noise. It was in its own way a kind of company she hadn't known she'd been missing. By the end of June, Obi had stopped going silent the moment she stepped into the barn. He didn't warm to her exactly, that wasn't in him yet, and she suspected, watching him, that it might never fully arrive, not in the soft way some people meant when they used that word. But one afternoon, watching her frown over a column of figures that didn't square with what the grain bins actually held, he set down his pitchfork long enough to speak without being asked. You're counting bushels like they're dollars. He didn't look at her directly when he said it. They ain't the same animal. And then, grudging every word of it, he told her why. Told her how the grading worked. How a bushel of good hard wheat and a bushel of shrunk, damaged grain could sit side by side in the same bin and never once be worth the same figure on paper, no matter what the scale said about their weight. Show me, she said when he'd finished. Not tell me. Show me. In the bin. Obi looked at her a long moment, something assessing in it, the particular look of a man deciding whether a request deserved the effort of honoring it. Then, without another word, he led her out to the grain bins and pulled 2 handfuls, one from each side of a bin. She hadn't known held different lots at all. Feel the difference. She ran the kernels through her fingers, one hand then the other, comparing weight and firmness the way she might have compared 2 hides for quality. This one's harder, denser. That's the good lot. Others from a section that got rained on before we could get it under cover last year. Looks near enough the same to an untrained eye. Ain't the same at all, once you know what you're feeling for. How long did it take you to learn to tell the difference by feel alone? Longer than I'd like to admit. Something almost like humor moved behind his eyes. Elias's father taught me, and I made a fool of myself plenty of times before it stuck. Man doesn't learn a thing worth knowing without making a fool of himself somewhere along the way. You'd do well to remember that, going forward. It was the first full sentence he'd ever offered her that wasn't an order, or a correction dressed up as one, and it was. She understood even then, standing there with grain running slow through her fingers, as close to an invitation as Obi Vance was likely to offer anybody, on any subject, in any season. A few days later, he set her a kind of test, though he never called it that. Left the bin tallies unfinished on purpose. She suspected later, and said nothing when she found them and worked them through on her own, matching grade to grade the way he'd taught her. When he came in that evening and saw her numbers sitting finished and correct beside his half-done ones, he only grunted, something that might, on a more generous man, have passed for approval. Didn't ask you to do that. You left it sitting where I'd find it. Did I? He almost smiled, careless of me. Taji wrote down everything he'd taught her, word for word, in the margin of the ledger, and she did not let herself make anything more of the moment than what it was. Though something in her chest, walking back to the house that evening, felt a little lighter than it had in weeks, as if a door she hadn't realized was locked had swung open half an inch on its own, without her needing to push it. Late one evening, coming back from checking on the horses, Taji passed the barn and saw a light still burning inside. Elias was at the far bench, planing a length of pine into slow, careful curve, sawdust pale against his boots. She didn't ask what it was for. She had a fair guess. And something in the quiet, unhurried way he worked at it told her plainly enough that this wasn't a thing he meant to be asked about. Not yet. She went on to the house without saying anything. Early in July, before the weather turned, Elias took her into town for the first time since the wedding, ostensibly for supplies, though Taji suspected, watching him find 3 separate reasons to delay the trip until she was ready to come along, that the errand mattered rather less to him than the company did. The mercantile was busy that Saturday morning, and more than one head turned when they walked in together, some curious, some carefully blank, the particular blankness of people working hard not to be seen having an opinion. Halloran himself came around the counter to greet them, wiping his hands on his apron, his manner easy in a way that told Taji he'd already decided, sometime in the 2 months since the wedding, which side of the town's quiet opinion he meant to stand on. Mrs. Merrick. He said it plain, no hesitation in it, the way he might have greeted any other farmer's wife in the territory. Heard good things about your harvest planning from Obi. Man doesn't hand out compliments easy, so I expect they're earned. He's taught me most of what I know, Taji said. Whatever compliments are owed, half belong to him. Modest too. Halloran's mouth twitched toward a smile. Elias, you've done well for yourself. Whatever the town's still deciding to make of the whole business. The town can decide what it likes, Elias said, without any particular heat in it. Won't change how we're living out at the farm regardless. Not everyone in the store shared Halloran's easy welcome. A woman near the fabric bolts. Taji didn't know her name, only her face, pinched and carefully turned half away, made a point of finishing her business and leaving without so much as a glance in their direction, and 2 men by the door lowered their voices to something just short of a whisper as Taji passed, though she caught enough of the tone, if not the words, to know roughly what kind of thing was being murmured. She kept her chin level and her pace unhurried, the way she'd learned to do at the well with Weston, the way she was learning to do with the whole territory, one quiet insult at a time. Elias's hand found the small of her back, light, steadying, and neither of them said anything about the women or the whispers, because there wasn't anything worth saying that the silence between them didn't already say better. It won't always be like that, Elias, once they were back in the wagon, the town falling behind them. I know, she looked out at the road ahead rather than at him. It doesn't need to stop bothering me for me to keep walking through it anyway. No, he agreed. I don't suppose it does. They rode the rest of the way home mostly quiet, though it was the kind of quiet, by then, that had long since stopped needing filling. The trouble arrived first as a rumor, the way trouble in a small territory usually did, carried into the kitchen on Emmett's boots, along with the flour and the coffee he'd been sent to fetch from town. Fellow at the mercantile was asking after us. Emmett set the sack down, not thinking much of it yet. Renner, I think his name was. Bankman wanted to know how the wheat was standing this year. Elias looked up slow from his coffee. Renner asked you that. Didn't ask me direct. Asked Halloran, right in front of me, like I wasn't even standing there. Emmett shrugged, still not reading the weight of it. Halloran told him it looked to be a fair crop. Renner just nodded and wrote something down in a little book he keeps. Obi, at the end of the table, didn't say a word. Didn't need to. His eyes found Elias's across the room, and whatever passed between them in that look, Taji understood enough of it to feel the temperature in the kitchen drop, even with the stove still going. He came out here in May too, Elias said finally, mostly to himself. Week after the wedding. Said he was checking on the note, asked more questions about the creek line than a man checking a note has any real cause to ask. The creek. Taji looked between the 2 men. What's the creek got to do with a banknote? Nobody answered her right away. Which, she was learning, in a household full of men who said less than they knew, was often its own kind of answer. Renner didn't come to the farm again that summer. He didn't need to. He had other ways of watching a debt come due without ever once showing his face on the land he was watching. In his office above the bank, the loan file on Elias Merrick sat in the same drawer it had sat in since April, though the papers inside it had grown a little thicker. A note here, a date circled there, and clipped to the front, in Renner's own careful hand, a single line that meant nothing to anyone who might have glanced at it by accident, and everything to the man who'd written it. Watch the crop. Watch the grade. Watch the water. He'd sent word to a grain buyer 2 counties over a man named Kessler, who owed Renner more favors than Renner had ever bothered to collect on, until now. Nothing written down. Nothing that could ever be traced back to a signature. Just a quiet word, over a drink, about a farmer out past the Merrick spread, whose crop might be worth grading a little conservative. Come harvest, a man could always use the extra goodwill of a friend at the bank. Kessler hadn't much liked the request when it came, and had said so, once quietly, over that same drink, but he'd said it the way a man says most things he doesn't like, and does anyway, and by the time the glass was empty, The matter was settled between them, if not entirely at peace in Kessler's own conscience. Renner closed the drawer, went back to his other business, and felt, if he felt anything at all about it, nothing more than the small, familiar satisfaction of a man watching a plan come together one quiet thread at a time, with no one on the other end of it yet aware they were caught in it. Kessler, for his part, didn't sleep easy the week before harvest. He'd built his business on a reputation for fair dealing, 20 years running, and the favor Renner had asked of him sat wrong in his stomach in a way that no amount of telling himself it was just business seemed able to shift. He thought more than once that week about riding out to warn the Merrick place directly. A farmer had a right to know his crop was about to be shorted before the wagon ever reached the scale. He thought about it Tuesday and again Thursday, and each time found some reason to put the ride off another day, until the reasons ran out and harvest arrived, and the choice, such as it had ever really been a choice, made itself in Renner's favor by simple default. It wasn't courage that finally cracked something loose in him. Months later, once the forged signature came to light, and the whole territory watched Renner's structure come apart in a crowded bank, it was something smaller and more ordinary than courage, the particular relief of a guilty man, discovering that the truth was finally going to come out, with or without his help, and that he might as well be standing on the right side of it when it did. He wrote a short letter to the territorial examiner, unprompted, laying out exactly what Renner had asked of him and exactly what he'd done about it, and signed his name to it plain, without hedging. It cost him some business in the months that followed. Men who didn't care for a grain buyer who'd once let himself be leaned on, however briefly, however guiltily. But it cost him less than the alternative would have the quiet, corrosive weight of having said nothing at all, and having to live the rest of his life alongside a man who knew it. July came in dry, then turned strange. The hail struck at night, at the very end of the month, with no warning beyond a wind that shifted wrong in a sky that went the color of a bruise a full hour before dark should have arrived. Obie had come in from the porch 20 minutes earlier, jaw tight, saying only, "Weather's turning ugly," in a voice that made Elias set down his coffee without finishing it. By the time the first stones hit, the whole household had gathered instinctively in the front room, drawn there the way people are drawn together by any threat too large to face alone. The first stones hit the barn roof like gunshots, scattered and sudden, and within a minute the whole yard was drumming with them, white and violent in the last gray light. Emmett pressed his face near the window despite Agnes's sharp order to step back, watching stones the size of a man's knuckle bounce and shatter against the porch boards. Somewhere out in the dark, one of the horses screamed, high and frightened, and Elias's hands curled into fists at his sides, useless against a violence no man could argue his way past. Taji stood at the kitchen window and watched it hammer the yard white. 11 minutes. By the clock she counted them, because counting was still the thing her hands and her mind reached, for when there was nothing else useful to do with either. The baby, low and constant in her middle, seemed to still along with the rest of the room, as if some old instinct in even the unborn understood that this was not a moment for movement. When Elias moved toward the door partway through, meaning to go out into it, Agnes put a flat hand against his chest and stopped him cold. "Nothing out there worth saving while it's still falling," she said. He stopped, because she was right, and because arguing with Agnes had never once gone well for anybody in that house, not in all the years Elias could remember trying. The storm broke as suddenly as it had come, the drumming easing to a patter, and then to nothing at all, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt, for a moment, like its own kind of violence. Nobody in the front room moved right away. Outside, the moon had come out clean and indifferent above a yard gone white and strange, like the wrong season had visited for 11 minutes, and then thought better of it. "Can't see what it's done till morning," Obie said finally, into the quiet. "No sense guessing at it in the dark." They went out at first light instead. The damage wasn't everywhere, hail rarely fell even, scattering itself in patches like it had a grudge against certain acres and none at all against their neighbors. But where it had struck, the wheat lay flattened and broken-stalked in wide, ragged swaths, heads knocked loose into the mud, the whole field glistening white, and wrecked under a sky gone innocent and blue again, as if it hadn't done anything at all. Elias walked the rows with his jaw set so tight Taji could see the muscle working from 10 feet off, said almost nothing. Obi knelt in one of the worst patches, tested a stalk between two fingers, and said even less than that. Emmett paced off the damaged ground in long strides, working out a rough figure of the acreage lost, his face gone pale under the sunburn. They didn't try to save all of it. Obi made that call within the hour, cut what could still be salvaged first, before the next rain worsened it, and let the worst-hit sections go without a fight. Nobody argued that kind of arithmetic once he'd laid it out. There wasn't room to argue it. Taji didn't go out among the broken stalks herself. She carried water and cold biscuits to the men working past noon in the heat, kept a running count of which wagon had come in, from which section, so the sound grain wouldn't get mixed in with what was damaged, and sat that evening at the kitchen table, refiguring by lamplight what the lost acreage meant set against what they still owed the bank. Come autumn. The number she arrived at was not a good one. She did not soften it for Alice when she showed him. He deserved better than a softened number, and some part that had grown, quiet and unplanned, over these last 3 months of ledgers and firewood, and shared coffee, in a silence that wasn't empty, understood that plainly enough not to need explaining to herself. Harvest came 3 weeks later, and with it a second blow that had nothing at all to do with weather. The price for wheat that year had fallen hard from where it had stood the season before, down to less than 2/3 of what Elias had counted on when he'd first borrowed to expand the acreage, a year back, when the numbers had still looked like they'd hold steady under him. They hadn't held. When Elias hauled the first wagon load into town to Kessler's scale, the buyer weighed it, ran a hand through a sample, letting the grain fall slow between his fingers like he was reading something written in it that no one else in the yard could see. Then he graded it low. Lower than any crop off that land had ever graded before, low enough that stacked on top of the fallen price already working against him, it wouldn't come close to covering what the banknote would demand by autumn. Elias said nothing to Kessler beyond a short nod, took the receipt, drove home with his jaw set in a way Taji had learned by then to read from clear across a room. That night, she pulled the receipt from where he'd left it on the desk and sat with it a long while under the lamp, next to Obi's own grain figures from earlier that week, figures that told an entirely different story than the one Kessler's scale had just written down in ink. It was Elias who found her there, near midnight, still bent over the desk, with a stack of her father's old letters spread open beside the ledger letters Clesta had sent over from the trading years, correspondence with merchants in Santa Fe, about hide grades and freight weights, and the kind of standards that decided, on paper, what a thing was truly worth, separate from whatever number a man with his own reasons chose to write down instead. You should be asleep. He said it gentle, not an order, just concern, worn thin around the edges from a day that had already asked too much of everybody in the house. I couldn't. She didn't look up from the page. Elias, this grating. It isn't just one man's opinion the day he happens to look at your wheat. There's a standard behind it, set years back, a real one that decides what separates a fair grade from a low one, no matter who's doing the looking. He came around the desk, looked over her shoulder at the columns she'd built, Obi's figures on one side, the buyer's numbers on the other, the gap between them laid out plain enough that even a man exhausted past thinking straight could see it in a single glance. You're saying Kessler graded us wrong. I'm saying, if this wheat graded as high as Obi believes it should sold to a buyer who applies the standard honest, instead of whatever Kessler's applying the difference would be enough. She finally looked up at him, not to clear the note outright, but enough to bring the bank a payment, large enough to buy an extension instead of a foreclosure notice. Elias was quiet a long moment, something moving behind his eyes that looked, for the first time in weeks, less like exhaustion and more like the faint, cautious shape of hope trying to find its footing again. We don't need my father-in-law to pay this debt, Taji said, and something in the word father-in-law, spoken plain and unflinching for the first time, seemed to settle a little more firmly into the room than either of them expected. We need someone else to look at the wheat, someone Kessler doesn't answer to. She wrote to Clesta that night, not asking for money, only for a name. He wrote back inside the week, with one, a grain merchant 2 counties south, a man who'd done honest business with her father's people for years, and owed Clesta nothing but the kind of goodwill a man doesn't forget, even after a long stretch of seasons. The merchant came out, took his own sample, weighed it against the same standards. Taji had copied careful into the margins of the ledger and confirmed within minutes what she'd already worked out on paper by lamplight. The grade was better, by enough to matter. It was Obi, in the end, who made the difference sharper still. Back in June, Taji had suggested carefully, still testing how much room she had to speak up in that kitchen, that when harvest came, they hold the best of the crop separate, rather than committing all of it to the first buyer at once. Obi had waved the idea off at the time, without so much as a word of agreement. He hadn't ignored it, though. Once the wheat came in, he'd quietly binned the best lot apart on his own, without telling a soul, and kept it back from that first wagon load to Kessler's scale. That grain, graded honest now alongside the rest, closed most of the remaining gap between what they owed and what they had. Elias took the merchant's competing offer to the bank himself, swallowing more pride in that one conversation than he'd spent in the whole of the past year combined, and came home that evening with an extension in his hand instead of a foreclosure notice. Nobody had saved the farm alone. Taji had seen the shape of the solution buried in the numbers. Obi had quietly protected the grain that made the solution possible. Elias and Emmett had salvaged what the hail left standing. Clesta had opened one door and asked for nothing in return for opening it. It had taken the whole of it. None of it any single person's doing. Obi found her in the kitchen the evening the bank's letter came, going back through the ledger one more time to make the final figures balance clean. He stood in the doorway a moment, looking at the columns over her shoulder, and said nothing for long enough that she nearly asked if something was wrong. Then he smiled. The first time she'd ever seen it happen, a small, startled thing on a face that didn't seem built for the shape of it, like a door hinge that hadn't been used in years finally remembering how to swing. That was a good call, Mrs. Merrick. It was the first time he'd said her married name, without a trace of the distance he'd kept behind it all summer. He turned and walked back out to the barn before she could think of anything worth saying in return, which was, she suspected, watching his back disappear into the dark, exactly how he'd meant it. Some men gave you a gift and left before you could hand it back to them, with thanks attached. August settled quieter than the 2 months before it. The worst of the danger had passed, the extension granted, the sound part of the crop safely sold, and for the first time since April, there was nothing pressing enough left to keep either Elias or Taji from noticing how the days had begun arranging themselves around each other without either one of them planning it that way. Elias found reasons to come in from the fields before dark instead of after. Taji stopped waiting for an invitation to sit with him, and Obi on the porch in the cooling evenings. The baby a small, constant weight low in her middle now, 5 months along and impossible to hide inside loose dresses any longer, though nobody in that house had ever once made her feel the need to try. One such evening, Elias finally brought the cradle down from the barn loft and set it, without much ceremony, in the corner of the front room. Figured it had sat up there long enough. Taji ran a hand along the smooth curve of the headboard, sanded soft as riverstone. You built this. Some time back. He didn't offer more than that, and she didn't ask. Whatever history the wood carried, it was his to tell when he chose to, and not before. They sat together on the porch a while later. That same evening, the heat of the day finally breaking into something bearable, the fields beyond the fence gone violet at the edges as the light failed. Obi had gone to bed early, and Agnes had chased Emmett off to check the horses one more time than strictly necessary, leaving the two of them alone with the crickets and the slow creak of the porch boards. "Can I ask you something?" Taji said, into the quiet. "That isn't any of my business to ask." "You can ask. I'll tell you if it isn't. Do you regret it? Any of it? Standing in that yard in April, saying yes to a stranger's problem?" Elias considered the question longer than she expected him to, turning his coffee cup slow between his hands. "No," he said finally. "Not the way you mean it, anyhow. There have been hard weeks. Hail. Numbers that didn't want to balance. But I don't believe any of that's the same thing as regret." He glanced at her, something careful in it. "Do you?" "No." She said it without needing to think it over at all, which surprised her a little, hearing it out loud. "I thought I would. In April, I thought I'd spend the whole year wishing myself back to before any of this happened. I don't, though. Most days I don't even think of before at all." Something in Elias's face eased at that, quiet and unguarded in a way she hadn't often seen from him. "I'm glad of that," he said. "More glad than I know how to say plainly." Neither of them said anything more about the shift settling quietly over the house that month. There didn't seem to be a need to. Some things, once they've started happening, don't require an announcement. They just require both people to keep showing up for them. evening after evening, until the showing up becomes its own kind of promise. It was into that quiet, that fragile, unremarked upon quiet, that Weston Marsh rode back into it, on a Tuesday afternoon in the last week of August, like a man who'd never once considered that a door he'd walked away from might have closed behind him for good. Taji was alone at the well when she heard the horse, recognized the gait of it before she recognized the rider some part of her body, remembering the sound train before her mind caught up and told her why it mattered. He listened in a few yards off, didn't dismount right away, just sat there looking at her, the way a man looks at something he's deciding whether he still wants, now that someone else has clearly gone to the trouble of wanting it first. "You're showing." He said it like an observation about weather, like it cost him nothing. "I'm carrying your child, Weston." That tends to show, given time. Something flickered across his face. Not quite guilt. Closer to inconvenience, a man realizing a debt he'd thought he'd outrun had simply been waiting somewhere down the road for him instead. "Heard you married." He glanced toward the house, toward the barn, toward everything that wasn't hers 3 months ago and was now. "Fast work. Faster than yours." She kept her chin level, didn't let her hands shake, though something in her chest had started up a low, frantic hum the moment she'd placed the sound of his horse. "You drove off before the wagon even finished turning around, Weston. Don't come back now and act surprised somebody else stepped in where you left a hole." He climbed down slow, came a few steps closer, and she made herself hold her ground, though every part of her wanted to step back toward the house, toward the door, toward anyone else who might come out and stand between them, because she thought, quick and hot and half panicked. "Because if he says one wrong thing, if he even looks at me the way he used to, if any part of me still remembers wanting to believe him, no." She cut the thought off clean, the way you'd snuff a candle before it caught something bigger. That part of her was done believing him. Had been done since the wagon wheels turned in the road and never once looked back. "I could still do right by it," he said, almost gentle. Almost, if she hadn't known better, almost kind. "The child. Nobody has to know it isn't his. Everybody already knows, Weston, or they will, the moment it's born early enough that even the slow counters in town can work the arithmetic." She let that sit a moment. "What is it you actually want? Say it plain. I've had enough of men who talk around the middle of a thing instead of through it." His jaw tightened. "Because that landed somewhere it wasn't supposed to. I want you to think about what happens," he said, voice dropping, losing its gentleness fast. "When your husband finds out I came calling. When the whole territory starts wondering whether a wife who welcomes her old sweetheart back to the well is really so married after all." There it was. The thing underneath the visit, finally spoken plain. "You'd spread that." Her voice went flat. "Not a question. I wouldn't have to spread anything," he almost smiled. "I'd just have to be seen. Once. In the wrong place at the wrong hour. Folks in this territory do the rest of that work themselves." She stood very still, because and here was the part that frightened her more than the threat itself, more than the smile, more than the horse still standing patient behind him, because some old foolish corner of her chest still remembered what it had felt like, once, to believe every word this man said, which made it worse, which made her angrier at herself in that moment than she'd ever managed to be at him. "Get off this land, Weston." "Taji," I said, "get off this land." Her voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. "You had your say back in the spring, driving off in that wagon. This is mine, and mine is. You are not welcome here. Not today, not any day that follows it. Whatever you think you can threaten me with, I'd rather stand in it honest than spend one more hour standing near you pretending otherwise." He held her gaze a long moment, weighing, she guessed, whether she meant it or whether this was a door he could still force open given enough patience and enough return Tuesdays. Then he mounted up, turned the horse, and paused, just before he rode off, to say one last thing over his shoulder, quiet, almost lazy, like a man tossing a lit match behind him without bothering to see where it landed. "I'll be around a while yet. Buying season's not over." A pause. "Think on what I said." Then he was gone, dust rising slow behind the horse, and Taji stood alone at the well, with her hand pressed flat against her middle, breathing hard, furious at herself for the 2 seconds, just 2. She counted them the way she counted everything now, because counting was still the only thing steady enough to hold on to the 2 seconds in which some small, foolish part of her chest had ached at the sight of him, instead of simply going cold. She didn't tell Elias that night. Told herself it was because there was nothing yet to tell a man had ridden up, said ugly things, ridden off again. Nothing had happened. Nothing worth carrying into a house that had only just begun to feel like it might, someday, actually be hers. But underneath that reasoning, and she knew it, lying awake long after the house had gone quiet, one hand still resting where it had rested at the well, sat a fear with a shape she didn't much like looking at straight on. That if she told him, he might look at her the way the whole territory would look at her, if Weston ever made good on what he'd threatened. That the careful, unremarked upon thing, growing quiet between her and Elias. These last few weeks, the porch evenings, the shared coffee, the mending done in comfortable silence, might not survive contact with the truth of a man who still knew exactly where to find her. So she said nothing, and told herself that was the safer choice. She lay awake a long while that night, the lamp long since blown out, listening to the ordinary sounds of a house she'd started, without quite noticing when, to think of as something closer to hers than a stranger's. Obi's slow, even snoring through the wall, the particular creak of the porch settling as the night cooled. Somewhere down the hall, Elias turning over in his own bed, the sound so familiar by now that she could have picked it out blind from a dozen other houses. She thought of her mother's hands, turning hers over the night before the wedding. You are not being sent away. You are being sent toward something. She hadn't fully believed it then. She found, lying there with Weston's threat, sitting heavy and unspoken in her chest, that she believed it a good deal more now, and that the believing made the silence she was keeping feel worse, rather than better, a betrayal, not of Elias exactly, but of whatever this had become, these 4 months, that deserved better than being protected by a lie of omission. She thought, too, of Weston's face at the well, the particular carelessness of a man who'd never once had to reckon with the weight of his own choices, and found that the thought no longer frightened her the way it had that afternoon. What frightened her now was smaller and closer to home, not what Weston might do, but what silence might cost her if she let it sit unspoken long enough to rot. By the time sleep finally came, she'd have all night to reach the same fear as it caught up with her twice more, the sort a person only pins into daylight when they've said it once, out loud, to someone who might actually be able to do something about it. 2 days later, Emmett came back from town with more than flour and coffee. Fellow was asking after you at the Mercantile, he said to Taji, setting the sack down, not thinking much of it, same as he hadn't thought much of Renner's questions back in June. Older rancher. Marsh, I believe Halloran called him. Asked was it true you'd married out here? The kitchen went very still. Elias looked up slow from his coffee, the same way he had the day Renner's name first came into the house. Marsh. That's the name. Emmett frowned, finally reading something in the silence he hadn't expected to find there. Something wrong? Nobody answered him right away. Taji felt the words rise in her throat, the whole of it. The well, the threat, the 2 foolish seconds she was still furious at herself for, and felt them lodge there, caught between the fear of saying too little and the fear of saying it too late. Because if I tell him now, she thought, quick and tangled, if I tell him now with Emmett standing right here, it comes out wrong. It comes out like confession instead of warning. Like I did something instead of something being done to me, which isn't fair. Except fair's never had much to do with how these things get heard, once they're spoken out loud in a kitchen with more than 2 people standing in it. So she said the only true thing she could manage, in that moment, with her heart going hard enough that she was certain someone else in the room could hear it. I need to speak with you. She looked at Elias. Only Elias, alone, tonight. Something in his face changed. Not suspicion, she watched for it and didn't find it. Something closer to a man recognizing, plain as weather turning, that whatever she had to say had been sitting heavy on her for longer than the last 2 minutes. Tonight, he said. Not a question. A promise to make the room for it. Obi, at the end of the table, didn't say a single word, but his eyes moved once between the 2 of them, careful, and something in his face settled into the particular stillness of a man deciding, without being asked, that he'd stand ready for whatever came next, whichever direction it broke. Outside, the light was already starting to turn gold toward evening, the fields beyond the window gone quiet and gold and waiting, the same way they'd been waiting the morning this whole arrangement began. Except nothing about the ground felt quite the same as it had that first morning. Something had rooted these 4 months, quiet and unplanned and real. And now, for the first time since April, something else stood ready to test whether it had rooted deep enough to survive what was riding back toward it. She told him everything. standing in the little office off the kitchen, the door shut, the lamp turned low enough that neither of them had to watch the other's face too closely while the words came out. The well. The horse she'd known before she'd known the rider. The threat, laid out plain the way Weston had laid it. And underneath all of it, the 2 seconds of something foolish in her own chest that she was still furious at herself for, though she made herself say that part too, because she'd decided somewhere on the walk from the kitchen that she wasn't going to hand him half a truth and call it honesty. Elias didn't speak until she finished, didn't interrupt, just stood with his arms crossed and his jaw working slow, the way it worked when a number in the ledger refused to balance no matter how many times he added it. He threatened to be seen with you. Elias said it back to her flat, testing the shape of it out loud, on purpose, so the talk would do the rest of the work for him. That's what he said. And you told him to get off the land. I told him plainer than that. A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but close enough to be its cousin. He didn't much care for the plainness. Elias was quiet a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped into a register she hadn't heard from him before, not louder, lower. The kind of quiet a man goes when the anger in him has stopped needing volume to make itself known. You should have told me the day it happened. I know. Why didn't you? Because the word rose up in her before she could stop it, before she'd even decided to speak, and once it started, she found she couldn't cut it off clean the way she'd cut off every other frightened thought these last 2 days. Because I was scared. Because some part of me still believed that if I said his name out loud in this house, it would undo something, would make you look at me the way the wagon looked at me, driving off. Would prove that whatever's been growing quiet on this porch these last few weeks wasn't real enough to survive the first hard wind that blew against it. She didn't say all of that. Couldn't, not yet. Not with the words still tangled up that badly on their way out. What she said instead was smaller. Truer, in its own way, for being smaller. I was afraid you'd think less of me for it. For any part of it. Even the part that wasn't my doing. Elias crossed the room. Didn't reach for her, hadn't? Not once. In 5 months of separate rooms and careful distance. And he didn't start now, not without her word going first. Same as he'd promised in April. But he stood close enough that she had to tip her chin up to meet his eyes. I don't think less of you. He said it slow. Certain. I think less of him. There's a whole world of difference between those two things. And I need you to hear it plain, because I mean to say it as often as it takes until you believe it clean through. Something in her chest, something that had been braced, coiled tight, ready to take a blow, finally let go. Not all at once, but enough that she felt it, the way you feel a held breath, finally leaving a room. What do? We don't do anything tonight. Elias's jaw set again, though this time it didn't look like doubt. It looked like a decision already made. Tomorrow, I ride into town, and I have a conversation with Weston Marsh that he isn't going to enjoy nearly as much as he enjoyed the one he had with you. He found Weston outside the livery the next morning, saddling a horse that wasn't his, arguing with the stable boy over a fee he plainly didn't intend to pay in full. Elias didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. He crossed the street at a pace that made 3 men on the boardwalk stop what they were doing to watch, and stood close enough to Weston that the rancher had no choice but to look up from the saddle strap and meet him, eye to eye. You rode out to my land. Weston's hand stilled on the strap. Didn't know it was against the law to visit an old friend. She's my wife, Marsh. Not your friend. Not anything of yours anymore, and hasn't been since the day you drove off and left her standing in a road. Funny. Weston's mouth curled, careful, testing how far the ground under him would hold. Didn't take you long to claim what wasn't yours to start with. Elias's hand came up fast. Not a fist. Flat against Weston's chest, a wall, put up hard, and Weston felt the full weight of it land. What's mine, Elias said, low enough that only the two of them caught the words clean, is a wife who deserves better than a man riding back around every time it suits him to remind her what she's lost. You want to talk about claiming things that weren't yours to start with? Marsh, you had her heart once, and you threw it out a wagon window without so much as slowing the horses. Don't come near my land again. Don't come near her again. And if I hear one word of the kind you threatened her with making its way through this town, you and I are going to have a very different conversation than this one. Weston's face had gone tight, red at the collar, the kind of red that came from a man caught out plain in front of witnesses he hadn't accounted for. He glanced once toward the men on the boardwalk, 3 of them, all watching. None of them pretending not to and found no help waiting there. Just curiosity. Maybe in one or two faces something close to satisfaction. You'll regret this, Merrick. Maybe. Elias stepped back, let his hand fall. But I'll regret it standing next to her. You'll regret whatever comes next standing entirely alone. Ride on, Marsh. There's nothing left for you in this territory. Weston mounted up without another word, rode out of town at a pace just short of a run, and if Elias felt any satisfaction watching him go, he didn't let it show on his face because some part of him, riding home himself an hour later, already understood that a man like Weston Marsh didn't disappear quiet just because he'd been told to. Men like that just went looking for a different door to push against. He was right to worry. Though the door Weston chose to push, in the end, wasn't the one anybody in that house had thought to guard. Elias rode home slower than he'd ridden in, giving himself the length of the road to settle what still sat hot in his chest. He hadn't struck the man. Had wanted to, badly. In the moment, Weston's mouth curled around that ugly little joke about claiming things but striking him would have made a story for the saloon that had nothing to do with the truth of it, and Elias had learned, somewhere in 30 years of watching men make fools of themselves in public, that the quieter victory usually held up better than the satisfying one. He told Taji what had happened that evening, plain, the same way she'd told him about the well. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, something in her shoulders eased that he hadn't fully realized had still been tight. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know I didn't have to. He held her eyes. I wanted to. There's a difference, and I'd like you to know it, the same as I told you back in August. Agnes and Emmett learned the shape of it over supper 2 nights later. Once Elias judged the household had a right to know what kind of trouble might still be riding toward them. Emmett's easy grin faded fast, replaced by something harder, older-looking, that Elias hadn't seen on the boy's face before. I'll keep an eye on the road when I'm in town, Emmett said. Man like that shows his face again. I'll know it before he gets near the well. That's not your fight to carry, Emmett. Family's family, Elias. Don't matter how new the family is. Emmett said it simply, without any drama attached to it, the way a boy states a fact he's never once doubted. She's my sister now. I look out for my own. Agnes said nothing at the table, but the set of her jaw when she rose to clear the plates told its own story, and from that evening forward, she kept a shotgun leaned within easy reach of the kitchen door that hadn't been there before, never spoken of, never explained, simply present, the way certain kinds of protection in that house tended to arrive without needing an announcement. Garrett Pruitt arrived at the Merrick farm 11 days later, in a buggy too clean for the road it had traveled, with a leather folder tucked under one arm and a smile that Elias distrusted before the man had said a single word. Mr. Merrick. Pruitt tipped his hat, though the gesture carried no warmth behind it. I wonder if I might have a few minutes. And your wife, if she's able to join us. Taji came out onto the porch at Elias's call, one hand resting, as it did more often now, against the round weight low in her middle. 6 months carrying now, and the careful loose dresses Agnes had helped her sew back in June no longer disguised much of anything, nor did either of them any longer feel any need for them to. Pruitt's eyes moved over her once, cataloging something. Whatever it was, it settled a cold weight into Taji's stomach that had nothing to do with the child. There's been some talk in town, Pruitt began, settling into a chair on the porch he hadn't been invited to sit in, regarding the circumstances of this marriage. Its legitimacy, one might say. A rancher named Marsh has been rather vocal on the subject at the saloon this past week. Weston Marsh. Elias' voice went flat. Talks a great deal, for a man with nothing true left to say. Be that as it may, Pruitt opened the folder, laid a paper across his knee that neither Elias nor Taji had been given time to read. My office has a responsibility to ensure the welfare of Apache women residing off the reservation boundary, particularly in irregular domestic arrangements. Marriages entered under duress or for reasons of convenience rather than genuine union fall rather squarely within that responsibility. Because Taji felt the word rise fast and hot in her chest, the same panicked rhythm she'd felt at the well, except sharper now, because this wasn't one man with a grudge. This was a government folder with her name written somewhere inside it, because if he decides this marriage isn't real, if he decides on paper, sitting on my own porch, that what's grown here these 6 months doesn't count for anything against whatever word he chooses to use instead, this marriage is legitimate. She said it before Elias could speak, before the frightened part of her could talk her out of it. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, given how hard her heart was working underneath it. Legal. Witnessed. Filed with the territory magistrate in April. I don't doubt the paper, Mrs. Merrick. Pruitt's smile didn't move. I question the spirit behind it. A hasty marriage arranged by your father under pressure to a man facing his own financial difficulties, I understand, with the bank. One might read that arrangement rather differently than a union of genuine affection. You'd be reading it wrong. Elias's voice cut in, hard enough that Pruitt finally looked away from Taji and back to him. But I don't imagine that's ever stopped a man from writing down whatever conclusion suited him best going in. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Merrick. So is threatening to take a man's wife and unborn child on the word of a jilted rancher and a folder full of conclusions you'd already reached before you ever rode out here. Elias hadn't raised his voice, but something in it had gone hard enough that Pruitt's easy composure flickered, just slightly, for the first time since he'd arrived. I'd call that serious, too. Pruitt recovered fast, smoothing the moment over the way a man smooths a wrinkle from a coat. I understand this is distressing. My office doesn't take these reviews lightly, whatever you may believe of my intentions. I don't believe much of anything about your intentions, Mr. Pruitt. I believe what's sitting in that folder on your knee and what it's built to accomplish, whatever kind words you're wrapping around it today. I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything, Mr. Merrick. Pruitt closed the folder. Stood. I'm here to inform you that my office will be reviewing the matter. Should the marriage be found insufficient in its foundation, there are provisions for relocating Mrs. Merrick and any child born of an unclear paternity to agency oversight, for her welfare, and the child's. The words landed in the yard like the hail had landed in July, flattening everything they touched. You will not take my wife anywhere, Elias said. Quiet. Final. And you will not lay a single claim on a child that hasn't even been born yet. We'll see what the review determines. Pruitt tipped his hat again, already walking back toward the buggy, unbothered, the way a man walks who's delivered exactly the kind of threat he came to deliver and doesn't especially need to stay and watch it land. I'll be in touch, Mr. Merrick. Mrs. Merrick. The buggy pulled away. Neither of them moved for a long moment, standing together on a porch that had, 5 minutes ago, still felt like the safest place either of them owned in the whole territory. That evening, word came a second time, and this one landed harder than Pruitt's folder had. Clesta rode in at dusk, his horse lathered from a hard ride, and the look on his face told the whole of it before he said a single word. Pruitt came to my camp today. He didn't dismount right away. Just sat there, jaw tight, the same stillness Taji had learned to read on Elias's face over these last months, except worn now on a face she'd known her whole life and had never once seen carry quite this weight. Told me the review would look kindly on the band standing. He called it, if I were to speak plainly when the time came about whether I believed this marriage was one of true feeling or one of arrangement alone. He's asking you to lie for him, Elias said. Flat. He's asking me to choose. Clesta finally swung down from the saddle, slow, older looking in that moment than Taji had ever seen him. My daughter's marriage. Or my people standing with an agency that's been looking for an excuse to consolidate us onto smaller ground for 2 years running. He didn't say it that plain. He didn't need to. And if you refuse him, Taji's voice came out smaller than she meant it to. Then he has his disorder to point at. A headman who won't cooperate. A daughter in a marriage he's already decided to call into question. Clesta looked at her, and something in his eyes, grief maybe, or something close enough to it made her chest ache, in a way the whole rest of the day hadn't managed. He's built himself a trap with 2 doors, Taji. Whichever one I walk through, he gets something he wants. Silence sat over the yard a long moment. Somewhere behind the house, Obi's voice carried faint, calling Emmett in from the barn for supper, oblivious to the weight settling over the porch. There's a 3rd door, Elias said finally. Clesta looked at him. Is there? If Pruitt's whole claim rests on doubting whether this marriage is real, whether it's built on something more than arrangement, then the surest way to shut that door is to make it impossible to doubt. Not with words. With proof he can't argue his way around. And how do you propose we manage that, Clesta said, against a man who's already decided what conclusion he means to write down before he's finished asking his questions? Elias didn't answer right away. It was Taji who spoke into the quiet that followed, and when she did, something in her voice had shifted steadier, The fear from the porch conversation with Pruitt folding itself, quiet, into something closer to resolve. Maybe we stop trying to prove the marriage. She looked between the two men. Maybe we take away his other reason for coming after us at all. If Renner's the one who's been circling this land since April, if he's the one who's been waiting on a scandal to use against us, then Pruitt's not acting alone in this. He's acting on a debt Renner wants collected, one way or another. Cut the debt out from under both of them, and neither one has near as much ground left to stand on. Clesta looked at his daughter a long moment. Something in his face surprise, maybe, that the girl he'd handed off in April, with such a heavy heart, standing in front of him now speaking like a woman who'd found her own footing entirely, without needing anyone to hand it to her. You think you can prove it, he said. Whatever Renner's been doing. I think, Taji said, Obi's been suspicious of that man since the week I arrived. And I think a man who's been quietly buying up water rights and leaning on grain buyers for 5 months has left more than one trail behind him, if somebody's willing to go looking for it properly. Agnes found her that same evening, sitting alone on the back porch steps, staring out at nothing in particular, and settled down beside her, without asking permission first, the way Agnes settled into most things. A man like Pruitt, Agnes, without preamble, wants you scared and quiet. Scared so you don't fight him. Quiet so nobody else hears you not fighting him. She looked over, steady. Don't give him either one, girl. Whatever else you give him. I'm trying not to. I know you are. I've watched you not give an inch to worse than him all summer. Agnes reached over and patted her hand once, brisk, the closest thing to open affection the older woman generally allowed herself. You found the grade on that wheat when a man twice your age with 3 times your schooling couldn't be bothered to look close enough to find it. You'll find your way through this too. Whole households behind you, whether Pruitt's counted us into his numbers or not. It wasn't much as comfort went. But Taji found, sitting there in the cooling evening with Agnes's hand warm over hers, that it was exactly the kind of comfort she'd needed, and more than she'd known to ask for. 2 days later, Taji rode out to her father's camp again, this time alone, with only Emmett's promise to Elias that he'd watch the road for her return. She needed her mother's steadiness more than she'd admitted to anyone, and she needed her father's memory of the territory's older business debts and grudges that stretched back further than Elias or Obi had lived to witness. Her mother said little, only held her a long while by the fire, the way she had the night before the wedding. Her father, though, sat with her past dark, turning over names from 20 years of trading men who'd lost land, men who'd left the territory sudden and quiet, men whose stories nobody in town bothered retelling once the dust settled over their old claims. There was talk once, Clesta said slowly, of a man near the North Ridge. Before your time, before mine here even. I never learned the whole of it. Might be nothing. Might be worth asking Obi if his memory stretches that far back. It was a small thread, but small threads, Taji was learning, were often the only kind worth pulling. They started with Obi that same week, gathered around the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high and the ledger opened between them once more, except this time it wasn't Elias's numbers they were sorting through. It was every scrap Obi could remember about Cyrus, Renner, going back years. There was a fellow, Obi said, slow, working the memory loose like a stubborn root, farmed out past the North Ridge. Before your time here, Elias, before you were more than a boy, most like. Fella named Dawes. Lost his whole spread to the bank inside of 2 seasons, sudden, as you please, right after Renner took over the note from the fellow who'd held it before him. You remember details, Taji said. Specific ones. I remember it because Dawes swore up and down, right up till the day he left the territory for good, that the note Renner called due wasn't the note he'd signed. Said the numbers had been changed somewhere along the way, the interest, mostly, crept up higher than what he recollected agreeing to. Nobody believed him. Man losing his land'll say near anything, folks figured. But I never forgot the look on his face when he said it. Wasn't the look of a man making up a story to save face. Was the look of a man who genuinely couldn't understand how the ground under him had shifted. Do you know where he went? Elias asked. Dawes. Last I heard, he'd settled 2 counties south, working another man's land now instead of his own. Obi's jaw tightened. If he's still living, and still willing to speak on it plain, in front of witnesses, that's a story that'd carry some weight in this territory. Renner's built his whole standing on folks believing his papers clean. One honest man saying otherwise, out loud, where the whole town can hear it, that cracks something. Renner spent years keeping shut tight. Taji was already reaching for a fresh sheet of paper. Then that's where we start. It took the better part of 2 weeks. Emmett wrote letters to the post twice, uncomplaining, glad for once to have a task that felt like it mattered more than fetching flour. Agnes kept the household running around the edges of everyone else's worry, feeding 4 people who mostly forgot to eat properly, until she set a plate in front of them and stood there until they picked up a fork. The letters came back uncertain, an address half remembered, a name spelled 2 different ways by 2 different postmasters, and in the end, Elias made the trip south alone, 3 days each way, to track Dawes down in person. He found him on the 3rd day, working another man's fence line for wages, older and more worn than the description Obi had given, but with the same steady eyes Obi had described. The eyes of a man who'd learned exactly how much the world could take from him and had decided, somewhere along the way, not to let it take his memory too. Merrick. Dawes set down his tools when Elias introduced himself, wary at first, the particular wariness of a man who'd been made to feel foolish once, in public, for insisting on a truth nobody wanted to hear. Renner send you? Renner doesn't know I'm here, and if I have my way, he won't know until it's too late to matter. Elias told him the whole of it, plain the forged signature, the water rights, the daughter of a headman standing between his family and a federal agent's folder. I believe you, Mr. Dawes. About the note, I've got proof enough sitting in my own file to believe you twice over. Dawes was quiet a long moment, studying Elias's face the way a man studies something he's afraid to want too badly. 6 years, he said finally. 6 years I've told that story to anybody who'd stand still long enough to hear it, and not one soul believed me enough to do anything about it. I mean to do something about it, but I can't do it without you standing in that bank, saying it out loud, in front of the whole town. And if I say it, and nothing changes, if Renner's still standing there smiling when it's done, and I've made a fool of myself twice instead of once, then you'll have said a true thing out loud, in front of people who needed to hear it, whatever comes after. Elias held his eyes. That's more than most men manage in a lifetime, whatever the outcome. Dawes looked out over the fence. He'd spent the better part of a decade mending for another man's benefit, and something in his face, weathered as it was, seemed to settle.
I'll come, he said. God help me, I'll come.
Evenings back home were spent at the kitchen table, cross-referencing every date Taji could find against the loan file. Elias still had copies of from his own note, because if Renner had padded one man's interest quiet over years, there was a fair chance the pattern showed itself somewhere in the numbers, if you knew to go looking for the shape of it. She found it on a Thursday evening, close to 10 at night, everyone else in the house long since gone to bed. The signature, Elias's own signature, on the renewal papers from 2 years back, before Elias had even known Renner held the note, back when the loan still sat with the Santa Fe Bank. Except set beside the signature on the original note from 4 years prior, something about the slant of the letters didn't sit right. Subtle. The kind of difference a tired eye would slide right past on any ordinary night. She held the 2 pages up together close to the lamp and felt her pulse pick up. Because this doesn't match. Because a man's hand doesn't change that much in 2 years unless something's wrong with it. Except wait. Wait. Look again before you say anything you can't take back. She looked again. Held the pages steadier this time, comparing letter for letter, the way her father had taught her to compare trademarks, scratched into hide long before she'd ever thought she'd use the skill for anything like this. It wasn't a match. It wasn't even close. She woke Elias at 10:30, and he came downstairs pulling a shirt on over bare shoulders, blinking against the lamplight, already half alarmed before she'd said a single word. Look at this. She laid the pages side by side on the desk. Tell me that's your signature. Both of them. Elias bent low over the papers a long moment, long enough that Taji's heart climbed into her throat waiting on his answer. The renewal. He tapped the second page, careful like it might bite him. I don't remember signing this. You don't remember, or you didn't. I don't. He stopped himself. Started again, slower. I signed a renewal. I remember that much. But this, his finger traced the slant of the letters. This isn't how I make my E, never has been. Look here, the ledger, 20 different entries in my own hand. He was already reaching for the ledger, flipping pages fast, laying his own known signature beside the disputed one, and the difference, once a person knew to look for it, sat there plain as daylight. Somebody forged this, Elias said. Quiet. The words landing heavy in the small room. Renner forged a renewal, padded the terms, and I've been paying against numbers I never actually agreed to. For 2 years. Which means, Taji said, and something fierce had crept into her voice now. Something that hadn't been there at the well. Hadn't been there on the porch with Pruitt, something that sounded, for the first time since April, entirely like a woman who had stopped being afraid and started instead being ready, which means Dawes wasn't imagining things. And you're not the first man he's done this to. And if we can prove it, really prove it, in front of the whole town, then Renner doesn't have a bank left to hide behind. And Pruitt doesn't have a debt to lean on anymore either. Dawes came north the following week, older than Elias had pictured, worn thin by years of working another man's land instead of his own. But his memory of the numbers hadn't dulled a bit with the wearing. He sat at the Merrick kitchen table, turning his hat slow in his hands the same nervous way Clesta had turned his back in April, and told the whole of it plain, the note he remembered signing, the interest rate he remembered agreeing to, and the sudden, sickening jump in what the bank claimed he owed. The season everything came apart under him. Nobody believed me, he said. Man loses his land, folks figure he's just looking for somewhere to point the blame that ain't himself. My own brother didn't believe me, and he knew me better than anybody living. We believe you, Taji said, and we mean to make sure the rest of the town does too. He looked at her a long moment, a young Apache woman, sitting at a farmer's table discussing bank fraud, like it was the most natural thing in the world, and something in his face, weathered as it was, softened. Never thought I'd see the day somebody took my word over Cyrus Renner's, he said. Whatever comes of this, ma'am, I'm obliged to you for trying. The bank sat on the corner of Cedar and Main, and on the last Saturday morning in October, it was fuller than it had any ordinary business being, because word had gone quiet through the territory, the way word always did that something was coming, that the Merricks meant to bring it, and that whatever it was worth a Saturday morning's trip into town to see with your own eyes. Halloran from the Mercantile stood near the door when they came in, arms crossed, curious, rather than committed to any side of it yet. 3 ranchers who held notes with Renner's bank stood along the back wall. A handful of townswomen who'd come in for ordinary Saturday business found themselves lingering by the counter instead, sensing correctly that ordinary business was about to be interrupted. Renner stood behind the teller's counter when they came in, Elias first, then Taji, 7 months along now and walking steady despite the weight of it, then Obi, then Dawes, hat still in his hand, and behind them, quiet, watching Clesta, who had ridden in that morning, without being asked, and taken his place at the back of the room, like a man standing witness to something he intended to remember clearly. Renner's smile flickered when he saw the shape of who'd walked through his door together. Just for a moment. Long enough that half the room caught it. Mr. Merrick. He recovered fast. I trust this is about your note. It is. Elias set the 2 pages on the counter, side by side, angled so the room behind him could see the shape of what he was laying down, even if they couldn't yet read the words. This is the renewal you had me sign, 2 years back. And this is my actual signature, from a dozen other documents in this county. I'd ask you to explain the difference, except I don't believe you can. Not honestly. A murmur moved through the room. Renner's jaw tightened, but his voice, when it came, stayed smooth. Handwriting shifts, Mr. Merrick, under strain. It doesn't shift like this. Taji stepped forward, and something in the room went quieter. Still at the sight of her, doing it, a young Apache woman, standing steady in a bank full of men who weren't accustomed to being addressed by one. I've spent 6 months learning to read grain grades and ledger figures I was never taught before I came to this territory. I know the difference between a man's hand under strain and a man's hand that was never his to begin with. And you, Renner said, something sharper cutting through the smoothness now, are hardly I'm qualified enough. Obi cut in, voice carrying flat and hard across the room, to remember a fella named Dawes, losing his whole spread 6 years back, over a note he swore up and down had been changed on him after the fact. Everybody in this room who was here then remembers it too, if they think hard enough. Man sitting right here now, if anybody cares to ask him direct. Every head in the bank turned toward Dawes. He stood slow, turned his hat once more in his hands, and then, for the first time in 6 years, said the thing out loud in front of the town that had never believed him the first time he'd tried. I signed a note for 8%. His voice shook at first, then steadied, the way a man's voice steadies once he realizes. Partway through, that people are finally listening. Renner called it due at closer to 14. Told me I must have misremembered. Told the bank the same. He looked up, found Renner's eyes across the room, and held them. I didn't misremember, Cyrus. I know what I signed. Man doesn't forget the day he loses everything he built, no matter how many years pass after. Halloran, by the door, spoke up unprompted, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who'd been quietly weighing something for years, and had finally decided to say it out loud. I recall it too, now that it's said plain. Recall thinking at the time it didn't sit right, and saying nothing, because it wasn't my place. He looked at Dawes, something like an apology in it. Ought to have said something back then. I'm saying it now. The room had gone entirely silent. Renner's face had lost its smoothness completely. Something colder and more frightened working underneath it. The look of a man watching a structure he'd spent years building come apart in the space of 5 minutes, in front of every neighbor whose trust he'd need to keep standing on afterward. His voice cracked, just slightly, before he caught it. This is a coordinated attack on my character, orchestrated by a farmer facing his own debts and an Apache woman with an obvious motive to discredit. The signatures don't have a motive, Renner. Elias's voice cut through, flat and final. Paper doesn't lie for anybody. It just sits there and tells the truth. Once somebody finally thinks to look at it, close enough. I've banked in this territory 11 years. Renner's composure cracked further, something almost pleading working into his voice now, aimed less at Elias than at the room at large. 11 years of fair dealing. You'd take the word of a farmer's wife and a bitter old man over a decade of my own good name? Wasn't my word that convicted you, Obi said, unmoved. Was your own handwriting, laid out next to itself, plain enough for a room full of strangers to see with their own eyes inside of 2 minutes. Don't go blaming us for what your own pen wrote down. A woman near the counter, one of the townswomen who'd lingered rather than complete her ordinary Saturday errands, spoke up then, quiet but clear enough to carry. My husband held a note with this bank 3 years back. Always thought the terms shifted odd on him toward the end of it. Never could prove anything. She looked at Renner steady. Might be worth somebody looking at that one too, now that we're all looking closer at everything. Renner's eyes moved once, fast, toward the back door of the bank, the way a cornered man's eyes move toward an exit. He hasn't yet decided whether he's desperate enough to use, but the room was too full, too watchful, and whatever calculation ran behind his eyes ended, a moment later, in nothing but a long, defeated stillness. One of the 3 ranchers along the back wall stepped forward then, a man named Coffee, whom Elias knew only in passing, and set his own note down on the counter beside the others. Might be my hand shifted too these 2 years, he said. Dry, though nothing about his face was joking. Might be worth somebody looking close at mine as well, while we're all standing here comparing signatures. The room shifted at that, a low murmur building into something with more weight behind it, more than curiosity now, closer to the particular energy of a town realizing, all at once, that a story it had quietly doubted for years had just been proven true in front of its own eyes. Clesta, at the back of the room, said nothing at all, but Taji caught his eye once across the crowded floor, and the look on his face, steady, proud, unhidden, carried her through the rest of the morning better than any words could have. It didn't end that morning in a courtroom. Didn't need to, not entirely. It ended in the quieter, more devastating way these things sometimes do. The territorial bank examiner arrived from Santa Fe inside the month, a precise, unhurried man named Whitfield, who spent 3 days going through Renner's books with a thoroughness that seemed, to the town watching from a careful distance, almost cruel in its patience. He called at the Merrick farm on the 2nd day, sat at the kitchen table with the disputed signatures spread before him, and asked Elias and Taji a long list of careful questions, writing down their answers in a small, precise hand that gave away nothing of what he thought of them. This is thorough work, he said finally, tapping the pages Taji had assembled, the dates, the cross-referenced figures, the careful comparison of Elias's known hand against the disputed renewal. More thorough than most claims that cross my desk. Did you have training in this sort of examination, Mrs. Merrick? No formal training. My father taught me to compare trademarks on hide, growing up. Turns out a forged signature isn't so different, once you know what you're looking for. Whitfield studied her a moment longer than the answer strictly required, something like genuine respect moving behind his professional composure. Well, it shows. He gathered the papers carefully. I expect this will take some weeks to run its full course through the proper channels. But I don't anticipate Mr. Renner will find much comfort in how those channels are likely to resolve. He was right. 3 other note holders across the county came forward inside that same month. Once Dawes's courage gave them room to find their own men who'd quietly doubted their own memory for years, the way Dawes had, and had never quite dared say so out loud until someone else's proof made the saying safer. Whitfield called at the farm a second time. Before he left the territory, this visit shorter than the first, mostly a matter of signatures and formalities, but he lingered a moment afterward, on the porch, hat in hand, in a way that suggested the examination hadn't been entirely without its own effect on him. I've handled a great many fraud cases in this territory, he said, to no one in particular, watching the fields go gold toward evening. Most of them uncovered by lawyers or by other bankers with their own interests at stake. Can't recall the last one that came to my desk built this carefully by a farmer's wife, with no formal training and a father's old trading letters for reference. She had help, Elias said, whole household, one way or another. I don't doubt it. Whitfield settled his hat back on still. Worth remarking on, Mr. Merrick. Whatever the territory decides to make of this marriage, I'd wager it's built on sturdier ground than most I've had occasion to examine. He rode out shortly after, and Clesta, who'd come by that same afternoon and overheard the tail end of the exchange, from where he stood mending a bit of harness by the barn, said nothing about it directly, though the look he gave his daughter across the yard carried more in it than most speeches could have managed. Cyrus Renner lost his charter before the year was out, and left the territory sometime in the dead of winter, quiet, the way men like him tend to leave once the ground under their feet finally stops holding. And it ended that same afternoon, in Garrett Pruitt standing in the doorway of the Merrick farmhouse one final time, his leather folder noticeably thinner than it had been 3 weeks before. The review's been set aside, he said, and something in the stiffness of his posture told them plainly enough how little he enjoyed saying it. Given the circumstances at the bank, there's no longer sufficient grounds to question the arrangement. There never were, Clesta said, standing at the top of the porch steps, in a voice that carried no triumph in it, only a long, hard-earned certainty. You built a case on a scandal a bitter man invented and a debt a dishonest one manufactured. Both of those foundations are gone now, Mr. Pruitt. I'd suggest you find sturdier ground before you come looking to build on my daughter's life again. Pruitt didn't answer that, just tipped his hat, the gesture as empty as it had been the first time, and climbed back into his buggy. And this time, when it pulled away down the road, nobody on that porch watched it go with anything less than the full, unguarded relief of people who understood, finally, that the danger had actually passed. That evening, once the house had settled and Agnes had chased Emmett off to bed with more sternness than the hour strictly required, Clesta found Elias alone on the porch, looking out over fields gone gold and heavy toward the season's second harvest. He sat down beside him without being asked. For a while, neither man spoke, the quiet between them comfortable in a way it hadn't been back in April, in a barn, over a bridle that didn't need mending. I was selfish the day I came to you, Clesta said finally. I want you to know I understood that, even then. Whatever else I told myself. Elias didn't answer that directly. Didn't seem to think it needed answering. I've watched the two of you 6 months now, Clesta went on. A man can put on a good show of duty for a season, if he sets his mind to it. I don't believe that's what I've been watching. He turned to look at Elias straight on. I need to ask you plainly, and I'd rather you take a moment before you answer than hand me something quick and comfortable. He held Elias' eyes. Do you love her? Not the arrangement. Her. Elias was quiet long enough that Clesta nearly regretted the bluntness of the question. I do. When it came, the answer didn't waver at all. I didn't expect to. I buried a wife once. Clesta, 3 years back. I told myself after that I was done building the kind of house that leaves a man standing alone in it, waiting on someone who isn't coming back. I wasn't looking for another chance at it. But I'm not sure I'd have believed you, back in April, if you'd told me I'd get one anyway, this fast, this certain. Something shifted in Clesta's face, not surprise exactly, more the quiet recalibration of a man learning a piece of another man's history he hadn't known to ask about. If the answer had been otherwise, Clesta said, I want you to know I wouldn't have asked you to keep pretending. I'd have taken her home myself, once the child was strong enough to travel. Whatever the territory chose to say about it after, I'd have carried that weight myself. And gladly. I know. Elias looked out at the darkening fields rather than at him. That's not what I want, though. I want us to stay what we've become these 6 months, not what we started as. He paused. Something shifted in his face before the next words came awkward in a way that suited him better than smoothness ever would have. Sir, Father, if you'll allow it. Clesta didn't say anything for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice wasn't entirely steady. I'll allow it. They sat together a while longer before either man spoke again. Taji and I have talked, Elias said eventually. She never had a wedding. Not the kind anyone would rightly call one. We'd like a day that feels like hers not to marry again. We're already married, and that's not in question. But something of her own to remember. Once this whole business with Renner and Pruitt has finally settled behind us, before the season turns too cold for a yard full of people to stand comfortable in it. We'll come, Clesta said, without needing a moment to think it over. Try and stop us. Later that same week, Elias found Taji in the front room, sitting beside the cradle, one hand resting on its edge, rocking it slow and empty, the way a person does when their hands need something gentle to do, while their mind works something else over. You're thinking hard about something. He sat across from her. I keep thinking about the day you brought this down from the loft. She didn't look up right away. You never told me who it was built for. Elias was quiet a moment, weighing how much of it to give her. Then slow, my wife. Sarah. We lost her 3 years back before we ever got the chance to use it. He glanced at the cradle, something old and careful moving across his face. I built it the winter before, hoping. Never had the heart to break it up for kindling after, and never had reason to finish it for anybody else. Until now, Taji's hand stilled on the wood. I'm sorry, Elias. Don't be. Wasn't a thing you did. He looked at her steady. I'm telling you because I don't want there to be pieces of me you're finding out sideways, through Obi or Agnes letting something slip. If we're building something real here, and I believe we are, I'd rather you have it from me. Real. She said the word like she was testing its weight. You never called it that before. Didn't have the proof of it before. He reached over slow and set his hand near hers, on the edge of the cradle not quite touching, leaving the last inch for her to close, if she wanted it. Closed. I've got it now. She closed the inch. The ceremony came the second Saturday of November, once the last of the wheat was in, and the frost hadn't yet closed its hand fully around the fields. Taji wore a dress that had nothing practical about it, chosen for no reason beyond that she liked how it felt against her skin, and stood with Elias in the yard, while her father, not as a headman settling anything this time, simply as her father said words over the two of them that had nothing to do with paper, and everything to do with choice freely made. Agnes cried through most of it, unashamed, dabbing at her eyes, with the corner of her apron between sentences. Emmett whooped loud enough to startle the horses in the barn, and earned an elbow from Obi for it that didn't stop him whooping again. A moment later, grinning wide enough to crack his own face in half. Obi himself, when the moment came, clapped louder and longer than anyone standing in that yard, which surprised exactly no one who'd been paying attention since the evening in the kitchen, when he'd first called her Mrs. Merrick, and surprised Obi least of all. Taji's mother stood close beside Clesta, holding his hand the way she hadn't needed to in years, both of them watching their daughter with the particular, wordless pride of parents who had feared, once, that this year might end in nothing but grief, and had somehow, against every hard turn it threw at them, watched it become something else instead. Dawes came too, riding up from 2 counties south for the occasion, standing a little apart from the rest of the crowd, with his hat in his hands, looking, more than once, like a man who still hadn't quite gotten used to being welcome anywhere. Halloran came, and brought his wife, and a jar of preserves nobody had asked for, but everyone was glad to have. Even Coffee rode out for an hour, shook Elias's hand once hard, and rode off again before supper, as if the handshake alone had been the whole of what he'd come to say. Someone had strung late-season wildflowers along the porch rail, more out of Emmett's enthusiasm than any real skill at the task, and they hung a little crooked and entirely lovely in the afternoon light. Agnes had spent 2 days on a cake that turned out, this time, exactly as it was supposed to, and stood watching people eat it with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had taught a girl to bake bread 5 months back, and now stood at her wedding watching the whole of that teaching bear out into something larger than either of them had planned for. Afterward, with the small crowd scattered warm across the yard, and the last of the November light going soft and gold over the fields, Elias found Taji, standing at the edge of the new-turned ground, one hand resting where it always rested now, watching the place where next spring's planting would begin, once winter had finished having its say. He didn't say anything grand. Didn't need to by then. He just stood beside her. And stayed. Behind them, the house stood lit warm against the coming dark, Agnes's laughter carrying faint through an open window, Emmett's off-key humming, Obi's low, patient voice answering some question. Clesta had asked him about the coming season's grain. A whole household gathered easy around a hearth that had started the year as a stranger's kitchen and had become, somewhere in the space of 7 hard, honest months, simply home. Taji looked out at the dark, waiting fields a long while. Then she looked at the man beside her, the one who'd promised her nothing grand that first morning and had somehow, without ever once raising his voice to make the promise out louder, given her everything. Ground neither of us chose, she said quietly. No, Elias's hand found hers, careful, the way he'd have asked permission for, even now. 7 months married twice over, if permission were still a thing that needed asking. But it's ours now. However we came to stand on it. She didn't answer that. Didn't need to. The wind moved soft across the turned earth, carrying the first faint promise of winter, and somewhere behind them, inside a house full of people who had chosen, every one of them, in their own quiet way, to become a family out of ground they'd never have picked for themselves. The lamps burned warm against the coming dark and held. Later that night, once the guests had gone and the house had settled into its ordinary quiet, Elias found Taji still awake, sitting up against the pillows with one hand resting, as it so often did now, against the round weight that had grown, these past 7 months, into something neither of them could any longer imagine the house without. Can't sleep, she said before he asked. Neither can I. He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. Too much day to settle down from all at once, I expect. It was a good day. It was. He was quiet a moment, watching her hand move slow and unthinking against her middle. You scared about what's coming? The rest of it. Some. She considered the honesty of the answer before giving it to him. Less than I was in April, though. I didn't know then whether I'd be facing any of it with someone standing beside me, who actually wanted to be there. I know that now. You'll always have that. Whatever else this next part asks of either of us. Elias reached over, laid his hand light beside hers on the curve of her belly, close enough now, after 7 months, that the gesture no longer needed an inch of permission left open between them. Whatever's coming, we'll meet it the way we've met the rest of it. Together and honest, and however clumsy that turns out to look most days. That's not a grand promise, Elias Merrick. No. Something almost like a smile moved across his face in the dim light. Never was much good at those. Learned a long time ago not to hand out more than I know I can carry through. I know. She turned her hand under his, palm to palm. The way her mother had turned hers the night before the wedding, all those months back, in a different life that felt, some days, like it belonged to somebody else entirely. It's why I trust the small ones so much more than I ever trusted the grand kind. Outside, the first hard frost of the season settled soft and silver over the turned fields, over the barn, over a house that had started the year holding 2 strangers and now held. However, the winter ahead chose to test it, something a great deal harder, to shake loose, than either of them had ever expected to find growing out of ground neither one of them had chosen.